Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The Beast of Erie. The morning air was crisp, carrying a faint mist that clung to the surface of Lake Erie. I had been fishing these waters for more years than I cared to count, and I knew every nook and cranny of this lake as well as I knew the back of my hand. The shores, the deep pockets where the fish liked to hide, the underwater rocks that made navigation tricky in certain parts, all of it was familiar territory. Yet today, something was different. I adjusted my cap and glanced out at the lake, where the fog still lingered like a heavy veil, softening everything in its path. The mist wrapped the world in silence, making everything seem far too still. The usual morning sounds, the calls of gulls, the faint rustle of the trees on the shore, were gone, replaced by a hollow quiet that seemed to seep into my bones. Even the water, usually alive with movement, looked unnaturally calm. I pushed the boat off the shore and started my engine, the low hum of it cutting through the stillness. I had fished here hundreds of times, always alone. It was how I liked it. The solitude. But today, as I drifted farther out into the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Something in the air felt wrong. The tension was subtle, but it was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I tried to ignore it, setting my line in the water and watching as it sank into the depths. Fishing was a ritual, something I had done for years to escape the noise of the world. But this morning, as I waited for the first tug on the line, the silence stretched on too long. I glanced around again. The fog seemed to grow thicker. Just a change in the weather, I muttered to myself, trying to brush off the creeping unease that seemed to have settled in my gut. But even as I said it, I knew it was more than that. Something wasn't right. The lake had never felt like this before. I waited. Time passed, but my bait sat motionless in the water. Not even a ripple disturbed the surface. And then, I saw it. Or rather, I saw the absence of it, a slight disturbance in the water far beyond where my line was cast. It was too subtle to be a fish. The surface of the lake was so calm that any movement on it stood out like a sore thumb. The ripples expanded outward, spreading in circles, but they didn't follow the usual pattern. The water didn't respond to the wind, nor did it have the irregular shape of a fish darting beneath the surface. These ripples were deliberate. They were too slow. My gaze fixed on the spot where the ripples had started, trying to make sense of it. Was it a boat far off in the distance? No. The water around me was still and empty, and I could see clearly across the lake. The ripples spread out from an area too small to be a boat passing through. A shiver ran down my spine. I reached for my oar, pushing the boat a little further to the side, trying to move away from the strange disturbance. But then, I saw it again, a darker, more defined shape beneath the water, moving slowly and surely toward me. I froze. I was too far from shore to easily make an escape. The boat was small, too small to outrun anything in these waters if it really meant to come after me. But I told myself to relax. It was just a big fish or a log drifting through the water. But the shape beneath the water didn't move like any fish I had ever seen. And it didn't look like a log either. It was too long, too fluid. The shape was unmistakable now. It was something massive, gliding just beneath the surface, its body undulating like a serpent in the deep. I swallowed hard. There was a flicker of panic in the pit of my stomach. No, I told myself, it's just a trick of the light. The fog plays games with your mind. But even as I thought it, I could feel my heartbeat quicken. The thing beneath the water was still moving, closer now. The silence of the lake became suffocating. I couldn't pull my eyes away from the shape beneath the surface. The shadow of it was too distinct now. It was long, with undulating movements that suggested a creature of massive size. And it was heading straight toward me. I forced myself to look away, to focus on my fishing again, to try and calm my racing thoughts. The line was still in the water, but no fish had taken it yet. I could feel the cold sweat beginning to trickle down the back of my neck. Something was moving out there. Something big. And I was alone. I scanned the water, trying to reassure myself that it was just a large fish. But the more I stared, the more I began to doubt that explanation. A fish of that size would have to be something extraordinary, something I had never encountered in all my years on the lake. The fog seemed to grow thicker, and the air, once crisp and cool, now felt heavy, oppressive. I could hear nothing. Not even the normal hum of the boat's engine. The world had become unnervingly still. Then, as if it had heard my thoughts, the shadow beneath the water vanished. The surface of the lake returned to its unnerving calm, the ripples gone as if they had never been there. But the sense of dread in my gut refused to fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still out there, still watching me. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my hands were shaking. I reached for the oar again, ready to row further out. It wasn't as though I had never seen strange things on the water before, boats and debris drifting, reflections playing tricks in the fog, but this felt different. It felt personal. It felt as though the lake itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the silhouette of another boat approaching, maybe a fellow fisherman, to explain away the strange disturbances in the water. But there was no one. The lake was as empty as it had been since I first set out. Just then, there was a faint splash behind me, barely a ripple, but it was enough to make my heart race. I turned, half expecting to see a fish break the surface, or maybe a bird that had flown too close to the water. But the lake was still. No movement. I breathed in sharply, cursing under my breath. My mind was playing tricks on me, or so I hoped. The wind had picked up slightly, the fog slowly beginning to break apart. But the unease that had settled in my chest only grew stronger. I turned the boat toward shore, a subtle instinct pulling me back. The fishing could wait. The lake could wait. Whatever it was out there. I wasn't ready for it. Not today. But as the boat's engine hummed back to life, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The engine roared to life as I turned the boat toward the shore, but my eyes kept drifting back to the water. The ripples from earlier seemed to have returned, faintly disturbing the calm, and for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the stillness or the fog. It was something deeper, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I shook my head. It was probably nothing. Just the lake playing tricks on me. But as I continued rowing back, I noticed it again, a faint shadow moving just beneath the water, slipping quickly through the depths. It was much closer now, too close for comfort. This time, I didn't need to convince myself. I knew that whatever it wasn't a fish. It wasn't a log. It was watching me. The growl beneath the water came again, barely audible but unmistakable, a deep, rumbling sound that made the water around me vibrate. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. The question now was, how long would I survive? I had only been out in the water for a little over an hour when I first noticed the ripples. At first, they were subtle, just small, delicate rings that seemed to appear from nowhere. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the slight wind that had picked up, though the air around me still felt too thick for such movements to make sense. I glanced down at my fishing line. The water beneath seemed still, the dark blue depths stretching endlessly, and yet the ripples continued. They spread across the water in perfect circles, expanding outward like a stone thrown into a pond, but there was no clear source. No breeze, no visible creature beneath the surface. Just the ripples, gently widening, then dissipating without a trace. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I straightened up, slowly scanning the lake, trying to figure out if something had disturbed the surface, but all I saw was the rolling mist and the endless horizon. The lake was empty. It wasn't until a few moments later that I saw it again, this time clearer. A shadow. Something dark and large, moving beneath the water with an unnatural grace. It was only for a second, just a brief flicker of movement, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I leaned forward, squinting through the fog, my heart rate increasing. The shadow was long and flowing, like the tail of some great, unseen creature, cutting through the water with ease. But there were no ripples to follow its path, no surface disturbance other than the expanding circles I had already seen. A sudden tension crept over me. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a large fish, or even a log drifting below. I had seen enough oddities on the water to not let something like this spook me, but this felt different. This was deliberate. And that shadow, the way it moved, was too fluid to be anything natural. I shook my head, pushing my doubts aside. It's just the fog messing with my eyes, I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen anything. But the unease grew. The ripples continued to pulse around me in unnatural, steady intervals, and the shadow beneath the water seemed to linger, watching me. The boat gently rocked, sending a shiver through me. I pulled my coat tighter around my chest, glancing nervously at the water as if expecting whatever it was to surface at any moment. But no, it stayed just out of sight, always beneath, always moving just beyond the edge of my vision. For a few long seconds, I just stared, willing myself to see something, anything, that would explain it. But there was nothing. The water remained still, as though the lake itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, a deeper ripple shot out, this one not from any visible source, but from a place just beyond the boat. It was bigger. Stronger. The movement below the surface was now unmistakable. Something massive, something alive, was moving beneath the boat. I sat frozen, my hand still gripping the fishing rod. The steady pulse of the ripples kept growing, becoming more pronounced, more erratic. Then, without warning, the surface of the lake broke with a faint, soft splash, just behind the boat, but too quiet to be anything close enough to be seen. I felt the boat tilt slightly as if something had brushed against it from beneath. I gripped the side of the boat harder, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just my imagination, wasn't just the fog playing tricks. There was something in the water with me, and it was getting closer. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts that were starting to spiral. There had to be a logical explanation for what I was seeing, or more accurately, what I thought I saw. Fog played tricks on the eyes, and the ripples were nothing more than the wind stirring the water. I had been out here alone enough times to know that strange things sometimes happen on the lake, things that didn't always make sense. But still, the feeling in my gut didn't go away. It twisted there, a knot that refused to loosen. My pulse was thumping in my ears, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my neck. I clenched my fists around the oars and tried to focus on the task at hand. The lake stretched endlessly before me, a vast expanse of water that had never bothered me before. I told myself to relax. I had seen things on the lake before, drifting debris, shadows in the fog, the occasional giant fish breaking the surface and a burst of splashing. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would explain this sudden sense of dread gnawing at my insides. I glanced down at the water, hoping to calm myself. The dark depths beneath the boat were still, almost too still. There were no fish moving. No waves. Nothing but a thick, suffocating quiet that pressed against my ears. It felt like the world had stopped, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I let out a shaky breath and glanced around the lake again, just to reassure myself. The fog was thinning now, but the sun was still hidden behind thick clouds, casting everything in a dull, gray light. The shore was far behind me, barely visible through the mist, and I was surrounded by water in all directions. A perfect silence reigned. The boat rocked gently. The only sound now was the occasional creak of the wood. I looked at my line, waiting for the slightest tug, anything to break the tension. But no fish. No movement. Only the ripples, those persistent, unnatural ripples that seemed to be coming from nowhere. I couldn't ignore them anymore. The ripples came again, distant this time, but still distinct. I stared, willing myself not to react. Maybe it was just a current. Maybe something under the water had disturbed it, something that I couldn't see. But that dark shadow beneath the surface, the one I had seen earlier, wasn't a fish. It wasn't a log or a boat passing through. It felt alive. The ripples, faint as they were, suddenly grew larger, spreading quickly like concentric circles, widening in every direction. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but no matter how hard I tried, it didn't make any sense. The water wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to be empty. I stood up, gripping the edge of the boat as I scanned the water. The fog had thinned, but still, the lake was eerily quiet. There were no sounds, no splashing, no wind. Only the slow rocking of the boat in a vast, silent void. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the tension mounting in my chest. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I was getting old, overthinking things, letting my mind wander too far. I had to remind myself that this was my lake. I knew these waters like the back of my hand. I had weathered storms, spent entire days alone on the lake, and seen things that were far more unsettling than this. So why was I so on edge today? I couldn't answer that. But I did know one thing. I needed to keep moving. I needed to do something to break the cycle of unease building inside of me. The longer I stayed still, the more I let my mind run wild, imagining things that weren't there. With a sharp breath, I picked up the oar and began to row slowly, the familiar motion calming me somewhat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ground me in something solid, something I could control. The boat creaked with each stroke, and the ripples beneath me seemed to recede slightly as I moved. I kept rowing. I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying not to think about the shadow beneath the water, the ripples that seemed too deliberate, too calculated. But no matter how far I rowed, the sense of being watched never left me. It hovered in the back of my mind, a constant nagging presence that refused to fade. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but the water, its stillness, its unnatural calm, remained a constant reminder that something here wasn't right. It wasn't just the ripples. It was the lake itself, somehow holding a secret I couldn't quite uncover. The silence grew even heavier. The farther I rowed, the more the water seemed to press against the boat, as if it didn't want me to leave. Something in the depths was stirring. I could feel it. But still, I told myself it was nothing. Nothing but the fog. Nothing but the lake playing its games. Still, the weight of that unsettling feeling clung to me, stronger than before. I rowed in silence, the rhythmic motion of the oar slicing through the water, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind running wild. The ripples had faded, the shadow gone, but the unsettling feeling lingered like a chill that wouldn't leave my bones. The mist had begun to lift, but there was still a heavy air about the lake, a stillness that made it feel as though time had slowed down. My boat seemed too small against the vastness of the water, as if the lake was quietly reminding me of how insignificant I was in this world of waves and depth. I had almost convinced myself to relax when the water around me shifted again. This time, the movement was unmistakable. A dark mass, slowly drifting beneath the surface, like a cloud passing under the water. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a ripple. It wasn't a fish. No, this was something larger, something far more deliberate. I leaned over the edge of the boat, squinting into the murky depths. The mass shifted again, drawing closer. I could feel my pulse quicken, my hand trembling as it gripped the oar. I leaned in even further, the boat rocking slightly as I tried to make out what it was. And then it appeared. A massive, glowing eye. I didn't understand at first. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The water wasn't clear enough for any fish, let alone something as enormous as the eye that now stared back at me. It was a pale, eerie green, glowing faintly beneath the surface, as though it had its own light. The glow was subtle, like the phosphorescence you sometimes see in deep water, but this was different. It was unnatural. It was deliberate. I felt the blood drain from my face. My breath hitched in my chest as I stared, unable to tear my eyes away from the vast, unblinking orb that was watching me from the depths below. The eye was too big, too intense to be anything natural. It wasn't a fish's eye. It wasn't a reflection of anything on the surface. It was alive. The sensation of being watched, the same feeling that had been building up inside me, was now overwhelming. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to row as fast as I could back to shore, but I couldn't. I was frozen, locked in place by the sheer terror of that eye. It was like nothing I had ever seen. The way it floated in the water, motionless, yet brimming with a kind of power I couldn't even begin to comprehend. It was too large, too deep, too unnatural. I could almost feel it staring into my very soul, searching for something, waiting for something. As the seconds ticked by, I slowly realized what I was seeing. This wasn't just an eye. This was a part of something far bigger. Something massive. The eye was just the beginning. The water shifted beneath the boat again, and I nearly fell over in surprise. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled away, backing up to the center of the boat, but the eye never left me. It remained, suspended beneath the water, unblinking, its eerie glow growing faintly brighter in the murkiness. It was like it knew I was there, like it was waiting for me to make my move. I wanted to scream. I wanted to panic and row for my life, but my mind refused to function. I couldn't tear myself away from the glowing, hollow eye staring up at me, its presence heavy in the air. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the eye slowly began to fade, sinking back into the depths, its glow dimming until all that remained was the stillness of the water. I sat there, motionless, staring at the spot where the eye had been, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Was it a trick of the light? A hallucination? No. I knew what I had seen. The lake wasn't just calm, it was hiding something. Something that had been watching me from below. I could feel my hands shaking as I gripped the oars again, my heart still racing, my thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirl of fear. There was no denying it now. That was no fish. No shadow. There was something beneath the water. And whatever it wasn't friendly. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my throat constricted, but I forced myself to swallow, to take slow, shallow breaths. The eye was gone. The water had returned to its unnatural calm, the mist rolling slowly across the surface, hiding the true depth of what lay below. It had to be a trick. It had to be. I leaned over the side of the boat, trying to see if there were any signs of what had just happened. There was nothing but the faint ripples that continued to spread out from my boat, now distant and fading. No glow, no shadows, no sign that anything out of the ordinary had ever occurred. I couldn't let myself panic. I had been out on these waters hundreds of times before, and I had seen all kinds of things, strange fish, shifting shadows, the way the light played on the water. The lake was big, and strange things sometimes happened when you were this far from shore. It was just my imagination. I had to have been seeing things, right? The fog, the isolation, the silence, it was enough to make anyone's mind play tricks. I had to keep reminding myself of that. Just a trick of the light, a shadow from the surface, nothing more. A large fish, maybe, or some old log drifting just below the surface, reflecting the dim light in a way that made it look like an eye. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself, the feeling never left. I glanced around, pulling the oars in closer, feeling the weight of the boat beneath me. The quiet was unbearable. There were no birds, no sounds of life from the shore, just the persistent hum of silence that pressed in on all sides. The longer I sat there, the more I became aware of how isolated I was. It wasn't just the silence either, it was the stillness of the water, the oppressive calm that hung over the lake. No wind, no waves, nothing to break the monotony of the endless gray. My thoughts began to race. Maybe I had been out here too long. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. I closed my eyes for a moment, shaking my head, trying to push away the image of that glowing eye. But even with my eyes closed, I could feel it, the presence, the sensation of being watched. It wasn't the water. It wasn't the lake. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. Something was out there. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closer now, lurking beneath the surface, watching my every move. The hair on the back of my neck stood up again, and I instinctively looked down at the water. There was no glow, no movement, nothing to explain what I had seen. But still, that deep, gnawing feeling lingered, stronger than before. I tried to breathe through it. I tried to reason with myself. It's just a fish, I muttered aloud. A big fish. A sturgeon or something. I tried to picture it, the way it could have glinted in the fog, but the image of that eye, large, glowing, unblinking, kept creeping back into my mind, refusing to be pushed away. I couldn't deny what I had seen, but I couldn't understand it either. It didn't make sense. A fish, no matter how big, didn't glow like that. It didn't move with that kind of intelligence, that eerie deliberateness. My hand tightened on the oars as I slowly turned the boat in a wide arc, trying to steady myself, to get my bearings. The lake stretched out before me like a vast, empty wilderness. The shore was miles away in every direction, a dark blur in the distance. I wasn't sure how long I had been drifting, lost in my thoughts, but as I scanned the water again, I felt it, that feeling even stronger now. I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. The stillness of the lake had returned, but the weight of the silence was now pressing in on me like an invisible hand. The air seemed thicker, heavier, like the lake itself was holding its breath. And for all the attempts I made to explain it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just below the surface, waiting. The glow of the eye had faded, but its presence lingered in my mind. My hands shook slightly as I gripped the oars again. The water around me was too still. The silence was too thick. I glanced down one more time, my heart pounding in my chest. The water remained dark, the depths impossible to see. And then I thought I saw it again, a flicker, just beneath the surface. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I wasn't imagining it. The eye, the shadow, the thing beneath the water, it was real. The sensation of being watched was now undeniable. It wasn't a trick of the fog. It wasn't the wind. It was something in the water. Something massive. And it wasn't leaving. The hours passed in a blur, the boat rocking gently as I tried to ignore the gnawing anxiety creeping under my skin. The lake, though still vast and silent, seemed somehow different now. The weight of what had happened, that strange encounter with the glowing eye, clung to me no matter how hard I tried to push it aside. I had told myself I would keep fishing, that I wouldn't let this strange feeling ruin the rest of my day. The sun was barely peeking through the thinning clouds, casting a muted light across the water, and I tried to focus on my line to drown out the gnawing sense of being watched. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive, like the world was holding its breath just before a storm. Every small noise, the creak of the boat, the ripples of the water, sounded amplified, as if they were all too close, too loud. I tried to focus on the line, on the fishing, but my eyes kept darting to the water, searching for anything that might explain the uneasy feeling tightening in my chest. And then it happened. A ripple broke the surface, traveling outward in slow, deliberate waves. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there was no breeze. The water was unnaturally calm, and the ripples, these ripples, they didn't make sense. They spread out from an unseen source, moving against the natural flow of the water, as though something beneath the surface had stirred them into motion. I stared at the water, my heart skipping a beat. The ripples grew larger, widening out in all directions, each one more pronounced than the last. And then I heard it, a deep, rumbling growl vibrating through the boat, reverberating in my chest like a sound from a nightmare. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The noise was low, guttural, and unmistakably alive. I had heard strange noises on the lake before, splashing, the groan of old trees settling in the water, the occasional creak of a distant boat, but this was something else. Something wrong. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the sides of the boat, trying to make sense of it. Was it just a fish? A really big one? The kind of growl a sturgeon or a muskie might make if it surfaced unexpectedly? I tried to rationalize it, but the growl felt too deep, too menacing to belong to any fish I had ever encountered. And then it happened again. The growl, this time louder, closer. It was almost as if something massive was shifting beneath the water, its movements slow, deliberate. My mind raced, but nothing I could think of could explain what I was feeling. The growl wasn't just a sound, it vibrated through the boat, through the very air around me. It sent a chill straight to my bones, the kind of fear that made your skin prickle with the sense that something was waiting just beyond your reach. I pulled the oars in tightly, my gaze locked on the water, but I couldn't see anything. The surface remained eerily still. The ripples had faded, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Every instinct in me screamed to row back to shore, to get away, to leave whatever was beneath me behind, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the fear that gripped me, unable to tear myself away from the growing sense of menace surrounding me. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by another strange sound, something between a splash and a dragging noise, like something enormous was shifting beneath the water. My stomach churned. My skin crawled. And then, as if the lake itself was taunting me, a sharp, splintering crack echoed from somewhere in the distance. It was like the sound of wood breaking under pressure, but it was too deep, too unnatural. I jerked my head toward the sound, but there was nothing. The mist had thickened again, the shoreline barely visible in the distance, and the only thing I could hear now was the beating of my own heart in my ears. I glanced down into the water, my eyes scanning the dark, shifting depths. The water was too murky to see anything, but I felt something moving beneath me. The boat rocked again, just slightly, like something massive had brushed against it, though I saw nothing. I gripped the sides of the boat tighter, my knuckles white, as I strained to hear any other sound, any explanation for the unnerving noises that had been building up around me. But there was nothing. Only the low, ever-present hum of silence. But then, in the depths, I thought I saw something shift, something large, something that moved with a weight and grace that couldn't belong to any fish I knew. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, convinced it was just a trick of the light. The water was too murky, the fog too thick for me to see clearly. But the sensation, that cold, heavy presence, I couldn't shake it. I wasn't alone. Something was beneath the water. Something massive, and I was getting closer to it with every passing minute. The tension was unbearable now, growing like a pressure building in my chest. The growls had stopped, but the stillness felt worse than any noise. It was the calm before the storm. I could feel the eyes, the unseen eyes, pressing in on me from every direction. I rowed, harder this time, desperate to move away from whatever it was. But it felt like the lake was holding me, keeping me in place. The tension was suffocating, as if the water itself had become a trap. The silence stretched on, and I knew, deep in my gut, I wasn't going to escape whatever was down there. It was waiting for me, patient, and I had no way of knowing when it would finally make its move. I tried to focus on my fishing, but the tension in the air, the oppressive silence, and the unnerving feeling of being watched kept pulling my thoughts back to the water. It wasn't the same as the usual quiet of the lake. This felt alive, as though something beneath the surface was aware of me, was waiting for me. The sense of foreboding that had settled in my chest was growing with every passing minute, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn closer to something that I wasn't meant to find. I forced myself to grab the line again, trying to concentrate on the task at hand. Maybe if I just focused on fishing, kept my mind occupied, I could ignore the gnawing fear. I cast my line into the water, watching it settle, the lure sinking slowly into the depths. The quiet lapping of the water against the boat was the only sound for what seemed like an eternity. Then, without warning, it happened. The line jerked, pulling hard. At first, I thought it was just a fish, but this was different. The tugging was too violent, too powerful to be anything I'd ever felt before. It was as if something enormous had latched onto the lure, something far larger than any fish in these waters. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively tightened my grip on the rod, but the force pulling at the line was overwhelming. The boat tilted to one side, nearly throwing me off balance as I tried to compensate for the sudden pull. My muscles strained as I fought to keep control of the boat, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the fishing rod. The force beneath the surface was relentless, yanking at the line in violent bursts, dragging the boat in a direction I didn't want to go. I fought to stay upright, my feet shifting on the slippery bottom of the boat, trying to adjust my weight to keep it from capsizing. The water rocked harder now, the pull on the line stronger, and I had to brace myself with both hands just to keep my balance. This wasn't normal. No fish I knew could pull like this. The line tightened, the rod bending under the pressure, and I could hear the reel beginning to screech, its gears grinding as the fish, or whatever it was, pulled harder. My knuckles ached, and I gritted my teeth, my body trembling with the effort of keeping the boat steady. I leaned back, trying to keep the line taut, fighting against the strain that threatened to tear the rod from my hands. It felt like something alive and powerful was trying to drag me under, something with a will of its own. The water around me churned with unnatural intensity, the ripples growing larger as the tugging continued. I could feel the weight of whatever was on the other end, a heavy mass that seemed to be dragging the boat further out into the open water. I glanced around frantically, trying to see what was causing this, but the fog and mist obscured everything beyond a few feet of the boat. There was nothing. Just a pull, deep and persistent, as if the thing below was playing with me, testing my strength. Another violent tug sent a shockwave through my arms, and I nearly lost my grip on the rod. The boat rocked again, this time dangerously close to capsizing. I shifted my weight, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a fight against a big fish. Whatever this was, it was something far worse, something I wasn't prepared for. The tension in the line intensified, the rod bending even further as if it were about to snap. I tried to reel it in, but the resistance was too great. The thing beneath the water wasn't giving up. It was stronger than any fish I'd ever battled. I took a deep breath and planted my feet, using my body weight to counterbalance the pull. Sweat trickled down my forehead as I gritted my teeth and pulled back on the rod with all the strength I could muster. The boat rocked violently once more, and I had to fight to keep my balance. The line screamed under the pressure, its tension so tight I was certain it would break at any moment. But then, just as I thought I might win this struggle, the tugging stopped. Suddenly, everything went still. The line went slack. The water calmed again, the ripples disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. Had it given up? Had I won? But deep down, I knew better. The calm was too eerie, too sudden. I looked around, scanning the water, trying to understand what had just occurred, but all I saw was the same mist-cloaked expanse. The presence was still there, hovering beneath the surface, and my gut twisted with dread. I wasn't in control anymore. Whatever had pulled on that line wasn't just some fish. It was something else. Something far older. Far more powerful. And it wasn't done with me. The silence that followed the sudden release of tension in the line was deafening. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and my heart hammered in my chest. The stillness around me was suffocating, as if the lake had become a waiting predator. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The tugging had stopped, but the sensation lingered, like a weight in the pit of my stomach, an undeniable presence that wouldn't let me go. I glanced at the water, the calm surface now feeling like a thin veneer over something far more sinister. The fog had thickened even further, and the shoreline seemed miles away, swallowed by the mist. The boat rocked gently, but I didn't feel safe anymore. The familiar comfort of the water had shifted into something wrong. Suddenly, the tugging came again. It wasn't gradual this time. It wasn't a gentle pull or a shift in the line. It was sudden, violent, like a snap. My hands flew to the rod before I even realized what was happening. The force was enough to send a shockwave through my body, my arms straining as the line went taut. I couldn't breathe. I struggled to hold onto the rod, my fingers slipping, the sweat coating my palms. My muscles burned as I fought the pull, but this was no normal fish. The force beneath the surface felt like it was pulling me down, like it was trying to drag me into the depths, and the boat seemed to move with it. It wasn't just the line that was being yanked, it was the entire boat, tipping at an unnatural angle. My mind screamed in panic, but my body was slower to react, too focused on keeping the boat steady and the rod under control. The water around me churned violently, sending waves crashing against the sides of the boat. I gritted my teeth and planted my feet, but the pull only grew stronger. The thing beneath the surface wasn't just a predator, it was something huge, something older than any creature I could imagine. I could feel its strength in every pull of the line, in the way it jerked the boat this way and that, testing my resolve. I could feel the lake shifting around me, as though the very water was alive, conspiring against me. I glanced frantically around, searching for any sign of the shore, but the mist had closed in so tightly that I could barely see anything more than a few feet ahead of me. I was completely alone, trapped in the middle of the lake, surrounded by nothing but fog, water, and the ominous force pulling at my line. My mind raced, the terror setting in as I realized just how vulnerable I was. If this thing wanted me, if it decided I was its prey, there was no one to stop it. There was no one who would hear my cries, no one who could help me. I had no way of knowing how deep this thing was, how far beneath the water it waited. But I felt it. Every tug on the line, every violent shift of the boat, sent a wave of primal fear through my body. I yanked hard on the rod, trying to fight back, but it was like trying to hold onto a lifeline in a storm. The water around me roared, the tugging growing stronger with each passing second. I could feel it now, something massive, something with a strength beyond my own. It was pulling me in. The boat rocked harder, its sides creaking in protest, and I had to fight just to stay upright. I could see the water swirling around me now, dark shadows moving beneath the surface, twisting and coiling in ways that shouldn't be possible. It felt like something was circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. I could hear the deep, rumbling growls again, that low, guttural sound vibrating through the boat, through my bones. The fear washed over me in waves, suffocating, consuming. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to escape, but there was nothing. No escape. Only the pull. Only the darkness beneath. The boat tilted dangerously to one side as the thing beneath the surface heaved, its movements too strong to ignore. The line felt as though it might snap at any moment. I couldn't think straight. My heart was racing, my mind clouded with panic. I tried to reel the line in, but it felt as if I was losing ground. My body was trembling, the fight exhausting me. I had to get control, had to fight this thing off, but the harder I pulled, the harder it fought back. I felt trapped. I was stuck in the middle of Lake Erie, isolated, alone, with no way of knowing what was beneath me, what was pulling at my line with such ferocity. The fog had swallowed everything. I couldn't see the shore. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't escape. And I could feel it, that cold, terrible certainty rising in my gut. This wasn't just a bad catch. It wasn't just some freak fish. It was something else, something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for me. And I wasn't getting out of here. The line went slack for a moment, and I couldn't tell if it was a trick of my own mind or something far more sinister. My hands were trembling, slick with sweat, my fingers stiff with fear, but I held on. The boat rocked with every wave, every shift in the water, but I dared not take my eyes off the line or what might be lurking beneath. The stillness stretched out, unnervingly quiet, broken only by the occasional groan of the boat as it swayed on the water. I felt a cold chill creeping down my spine, and that strange, gnawing sense of being watched grew once again. I forced myself to glance at the water. The surface was almost unnaturally calm, the fog hovering just above it like a thick, suffocating blanket. And then I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't much at first, just a dark shape beneath the surface, moving with a slow, undulating motion that sent a ripple through the water, distorting the otherwise perfect calm. It was large, though I couldn't tell how large, too deep to make out clearly, but it was there. The shadow shifted, and in that moment, my heart skipped a beat. It was moving toward me. I stood frozen, staring at the water, my grip tightening on the rod. I had to be imagining things. But as I looked closer, it became undeniable. The shadow was growing larger, its shape becoming clearer. It wasn't just a patch of darkness, it had form, a presence. I saw it move again, slowly at first, but then quicker, as if it had sensed my awareness. The shape beneath the water was vast, almost alien. It was long, serpentine, with undulating movements that reminded me of a snake. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before, and it wasn't supposed to be here. I jerked back from the side of the boat, instinctively trying to put as much distance between myself and whatever was beneath me. But there was nowhere to go. The fog pressed in, blurring everything except the suffocating dark water around me. My mind raced, panic flooding my veins. No. This can't be real. But it was. The shadow grew even closer, and now I could see the shape more clearly, a massive form, stretching impossibly long beneath the surface, its outline dark and shifting, curling and twisting in the depths. It was like nothing I had ever imagined, too massive to be any creature I knew. It moved as if the water bent around it, as though the lake itself were bending to its will. I could hear the softest of splashes beneath the surface now, like the sound of something heavy moving through the water, displacing it with every slow motion. My breath came out in ragged gasps, my mind struggling to find a reason, a way to explain this, but there was no logic here. There was no explanation. It was closer now. I could see its form more distinctly, its shape becoming a twisted silhouette of something monstrous, something with far too many contours and limbs to be natural. The shadows beneath the water swirled around it like an ever-moving storm. My stomach churned, a sick realization settling deep within me. The shape wasn't just close, it was coming toward me. My mind screamed to run, to escape, but the boat felt anchored in place. The water seemed to pull me back toward that shadow, pulling me deeper into its presence, like I was being dragged by invisible chains. The line snapped taut again, the rod vibrating under the pressure, but I was too terrified to react. I was too transfixed by the thing beneath the water to do anything else. It's too close now. I could see the edges of what I had mistaken for a shadow, stretching, becoming more defined. Whatever this thing was, it was far bigger than any fish in this lake. Its movements were fluid, but there was a predatory grace to them. It was hunting. and it was hunting me. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched in horror. The shadow grew larger, more distinct, and I saw something else, something that made my stomach drop and my blood run cold. In the depths of the water, there was a glow. A faint, unnatural light emanating from within the shadow, illuminating parts of it that shouldn't be visible. It wasn't just dark, it was alive, and something about that glow made it feel even more monstrous. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare as the shape shifted, its size expanding in ways that shouldn't be possible. The silhouette twisted, and I could make out what looked like massive scales, glistening beneath the surface, reflecting the faint glow from below. The sound of water splashing beneath me grew louder, and the boat rocked violently as the thing moved closer, too close now. I didn't have time to think, to react. All I could do was feel the coldness creeping over my skin, as if the air itself had turned to ice. And then, a single thought, I am not alone. And it was only a matter of time before it would make its move. The shadow was no longer just a distant threat. It was here. It was with me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The shadow beneath the water wasn't just some distant, unknowable threat. It was here, moving ever closer, and every inch it gained felt like a tightening noose around my chest. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, but my mind couldn't even process the full enormity of what I was facing. I looked around, the fog thickening even more, the mist swirling like something alive. The shoreline was nowhere to be seen, and the expanse of water around me felt endless, suffocating. I was trapped in the middle of the lake, alone, with only the ever-encroaching presence beneath the surface for company. I could feel it now, its movements in the water, slow but deliberate. Each ripple was a signal of its approach, a reminder that I wasn't alone. I wasn't supposed to be here. My breath quickened as I gripped the edge of the boat, looking frantically toward where the shore should have been. Leave. Get out of here. Now. The thought was the only clear thing in my mind. I couldn't stay. There was no fight I could win. There was no logic in this anymore. I had to get away. I had to survive. I stumbled to the boat's motor, my hands shaking as I yanked the cord. The engine sputtered and coughed, but it didn't start. Panic surged within me, and I tried again, pulling harder, desperate, but the motor only gave a few coughs before going silent. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked over my shoulder at the water, waiting for something to break the surface. The glow from beneath was intensifying, faint at first, but now undeniably present, as if the creature had somehow turned the lake into its own glowing lair. Come on. Please, start. I wrenched at the motor again, my hands slick with sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs as the boat rocked with the force of my frantic movements. The tension in the line, still tight, still pulling, was more than just the weight of a catch now. It felt like a tether, anchoring me to the water, anchoring me to the thing below. The engine sputtered to life, then stalled again. I cursed under my breath and yanked it once more, desperately trying to get some power, anything, to break free from this nightmare. But the harder I tried, the more I felt the water pulling. The boat seemed to shift unnaturally, as if something was pushing against it from below, pushing it further out. A low, guttural growl echoed from beneath the boat, deep and rumbling, vibrating the wood under my feet. It wasn't a sound made by anything in the lake that I had ever heard. It was a warning, primal and raw, and my blood ran cold as I realized that the creature, whatever it was toying with me, keeping me here, keeping me from leaving. The boat lurched, tilting at an angle that made my stomach churn. I nearly lost my footing as I scrambled back to the edge. The water was beginning to churn around the boat, swirling as if the lake itself had come alive, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of something massive moving beneath the surface, its presence pushing against me. It wasn't just pulling at the line anymore, it was pulling at the boat itself. I tried to start the engine again, but it was useless. The thing beneath the water was too strong, too relentless. It was holding me here. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I was being kept in place, trapped. My hand gripped the rod so tightly it was numb, but there was no way I could fight this, no way to outrun it. I reached for the oars, desperate, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. I rowed with all the strength I could muster, pushing against the water, but the boat didn't move. It felt like I was paddling through thick molasses, the water itself resisting every stroke. I was getting nowhere. God, no! Why won't it let me go? The fear in my chest began to rise into full-blown panic. I could see the shadows beneath the water, circling, growing larger with every passing moment. There was no escape. No way to outrun whatever was down there. And as I struggled against the unseen force beneath the lake, the horrible realization dawned on me. I wasn't going anywhere. The thing in the water, it had trapped me. Somehow, it had locked me in place, keeping me from escaping. My boat was no longer my escape, it was my prison. The water around me swirled again, and I felt it, deep in my bones. The presence was drawing closer, the glow beneath the surface brightening, its ominous glow now unmistakable, lighting up the entire lake beneath me. I knew, deep in my gut, that I was being watched. And the creature, whatever it was savoring my fear. I couldn't leave. I couldn't get away. And the horrible thought hit me with full force. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was the beginning. And I was already its prey. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The terror I had been suppressing broke free, flooding my mind in a torrent of raw, unrelenting fear. I gripped the edge of the boat, my knuckles white, as the engine sputtered to life again. My hands shook so badly that I could barely hold the throttle steady, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. I needed to get out. I needed to leave, to escape whatever was lurking beneath the surface of Lake Erie. The engine rumbled to life with a hesitant cough, and I turned the throttle, hoping the boat would lurch forward. For a moment, nothing happened. A sickening silence fell over me, broken only by the sound of my ragged breaths and the distant lapping of water against the boat's sides. Then, without warning, the boat lurched violently. I was thrown forward, nearly losing my balance as the boat rocked hard to one side. My stomach churned with the sudden motion, my mind scrambling to process what was happening. It felt like something massive, unseen, was pressing up against the hull from beneath. The water splashed violently around the edges, and I heard a deep, resonating rumble beneath the surface, like the growl of something enormous. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest as I fought to regain my footing. The boat rocked again, even harder this time, sending me stumbling toward the side. My pulse raced as I instinctively grabbed the side of the boat, my knuckles raw with the force of my grip. The water splashed higher now, spraying my face as if the lake itself were rising to meet me. A slow, deliberate movement beneath the water. The sensation of something massive shifting below. I knew it wasn't just the wind or a passing wave. This wasn't natural. Nothing in this lake should be moving like this. The boat groaned under the weight of whatever was pushing against it. I glanced over the side, my eyes frantically searching the water, expecting to see something, anything, but the surface remained unnervingly calm, too still, too perfect. But that didn't stop the sensation, the pressure building beneath me. It was like the lake was holding its breath, waiting. Then, with a deafening crack, the boat rocked again, this time throwing me off balance completely. My legs buckled, and I was sent sprawling on the deck, my heart racing as I scrambled to catch myself. The boat tipped so far to the side that I was sure it was about to capsize. I looked down, instinctively, toward the water. I could feel the pull beneath me, like the lake itself was trying to drag me under. The sensation was so real, so powerful, I thought I could actually feel the weight of whatever was beneath pushing up toward the boat. A horrible realization began to settle over me, a gnawing certainty. It wasn't just rocking the boat. It wasn't just waves or some freak current. The thing in the water was moving, circling, and whatever it was huge. It was powerful enough to move the boat with its sheer presence, to shift the very water around me as though it were nothing. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and desperately tried to get a better view of the water, but the fog had thickened even more, shrouding everything in a ghostly haze. The outlines of distant islands were barely visible, and the shore was so far behind me now that I could hardly make it out through the mist. Another violent lurch, and the boat tilted dangerously again. I barely managed to steady myself, clinging to the sides, but it was as if the water itself were working against me, pulling, pushing, and twisting around the boat with a force I couldn't fight. It's real. It's really happening. My thoughts were scattered, my mind a jumble of fear and disbelief. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be on this lake with whatever this thing was, but I was trapped. The boat wasn't moving. The motor barely responded to my attempts to move it forward, as if the water itself was holding me in place, preventing me from escaping. A deep, bone-rattling growl rolled up from the depths beneath the boat. This time, it wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration, a tremor in the very air, like the growl of a beast coming from somewhere deep below. The water surged upward, splashing against the sides of the boat, as if the beast beneath was preparing to rise, to break through the surface. The boat rocked again, this time with a force that sent a wave of cold panic rushing through me. The glow beneath the water intensified, casting an eerie light through the depths. I could see shapes moving in the water now, great, undulating shadows, swirling beneath the surface, circling closer and closer. The sense of being watched, of being surrounded, of being hunted, it was suffocating. I needed to leave. I had to leave. I yanked the throttle again, desperately trying to get the engine to respond, but it was no use. The boat remained eerily still, stuck in place, rocking violently but unable to move. And then I saw it. The shape in the water, massive and glowing, just beneath the surface. A part of it broke the surface for a split second, a monstrous form that seemed to stretch across the entire lake, its glowing scales shimmering in the dim light. It was waiting. And with that, the horror truly set in. I wasn't just stuck. I wasn't just facing some creature from the depths. I was its prey. And it was getting closer. The world around me seemed to narrow, the air thickening with a sense of dread so heavy it was suffocating. Every small sound, the lapping of water, the creak of the boat, seemed amplified, as though the lake itself was holding its breath. My hands gripped the side of the boat, my body rigid with tension as I tried to steady my rapidly escalating panic. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Every part of me screamed to escape, but I was rooted to the spot, as though something invisible was pulling me deeper into the lake's dark heart. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, so deep, so resonant, it vibrated in my chest. It wasn't the growl I had heard earlier. No, this was different. This was the sound of something alive, something huge, something ancient, breathing from below. In the silence that followed, it was all I could hear. Slow. Steady. Inhale. Exhale. The deep rhythm of it echoed from the water, each breath a reminder that the creature was still down there, watching, waiting. The sound was almost hypnotic, like the pulse of the lake itself, but it wasn't the kind of sound I could ignore. It was too real. Too close. I dared not look over the side. I could already feel the water around me shifting, undulating with the movements of something massive just beneath the surface. The glow from below was brighter now, more pronounced, as if the creature were sending out some signal, announcing its presence. I tried to force myself to think, to calm down, but the steady rhythm of that breathing only amplified my fear. It's breathing. It's alive. The thought echoed in my mind, and it settled like a stone in my gut. This was no trick of the water, no natural phenomenon. This was something else, something alive, something far larger and far more dangerous than anything I had ever imagined. The boat shifted again, rocking beneath me, but it wasn't from the waves or a passing wind. The motion was too deliberate, too forceful. My heart raced as I felt the weight of something massive moving beneath the hull, its presence undeniable now. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. I could feel its power, its size, pressing against the very bones of the boat. I leaned over the side of the boat, my breath shallow, as I tried to catch a glimpse of whatever was below. The water was opaque, dark with the murkiness of the lake, but in the distance, I thought I saw something. A shadow? No. It was more than that. It was a shape, vast, undulating, and impossibly long. My mind couldn't quite comprehend the scale of it, but I could sense it in my bones. It was huge. The lake was its domain, and I was nothing more than an intruder. Another deep breath rumbled up from below, and this time I felt it in my chest. It was a warning. A reminder that whatever was down there wasn't going to let me escape. It was playing with me, toying with me like a cat with a mouse. The creature didn't need to rush, it had all the time in the world. My thoughts raced, but they were clouded by fear. I tried to reason with myself, to tell myself that I wasn't seeing things, that it was all in my head. But there was no denying the sound. The rhythmic breathing. The pressure of something alive, something far older than anything I had ever encountered, lurking just below the surface. I could feel the weight of its gaze, even if I couldn't see its eyes. I need to get out of here. But how? The boat was still unmoving, the motor useless, the oars futile against the force below. The water around me shifted again, and I could feel the creature's presence grow stronger. Each breath it took seemed to echo louder in my mind, pulling me deeper into its world, into its grasp. A feeling of helplessness swept over me, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. There was no escape from this. There was no fight to win. The creature below me was far too powerful, far too vast. It didn't need to hunt. It didn't need to chase. It only needed to wait. And I was already trapped. Another exhale, louder this time, closer. I could almost hear the deep rumble of it in the air now. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself. But the breathing, it didn't stop. It never stopped. It was constant, rhythmic, like a clock ticking down to something inevitable. The very sound of it haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the lake, the fog, the creature beneath. I wasn't going anywhere, not unless it wanted me to, and it seemed that the lake had already decided my fate. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, drowning every rational thought. My hands trembled as I reached for the throttle again, my fingers slick with sweat as I fumbled to start the engine. The lake seemed to close in on me, suffocating, as if the very air itself were thick with dread. I could hear the rhythmic breathing beneath me, growing louder with each passing moment, its weight pressing down on me like an invisible hand, forcing the boat lower into the water. The motor sputtered and coughed, refusing to turn over, as if the lake itself were fighting back, not allowing me to escape. I slammed my fist against the control panel, my frustration rising in a desperate, choking wave. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood thundering in my ears as I twisted the throttle again and again, praying for any sign of movement, any sign that the engine might finally catch. But it didn't. The boat rocked again, this time harder, as though something beneath had taken a purposeful swipe at it, pushing it violently to the side. I staggered, barely able to keep my balance as the hull groaned under the strain. I could feel the pressure growing, a crushing weight pressing against the sides, as though the lake was trying to crush me, to hold me in place, to drag me down into the depths. The breath, deep and low, reverberated in my bones, reminding me of the creature's presence, its power. I looked over the side, unable to stop myself, and that's when I saw it, a shadow moving beneath the water, impossibly large, gliding with a predatory grace. The shape was vast, dark, and it seemed to pulse with life. It was circling the boat, just out of sight, but I could feel its presence in every fiber of my being. It was waiting. With a strangled gasp, I turned back to the motor, desperate. The engine had to start. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait for it to close in. The fog was thick now, so thick that I couldn't even see the shore. The water around me was an impenetrable, opaque black, swirling and shifting with an unnatural rhythm. And then I felt it. A sudden, violent tug on the boat, a force that ripped the hull sideways. My stomach lurched, and I nearly lost my footing as I clutched at the boat's sides to steady myself. My head spun. The lake is alive. The thought burned in my mind, sickening in its truth. The very water around me was working against me, keeping me trapped in its embrace. The boat seemed to be sinking lower, each passing moment bringing it closer to the waterline. I shoved the throttle forward again, praying that this time the engine would respond. The motor roared to life, a sputtering, gasping noise that barely reached my ears over the deafening sound of my heartbeat. The boat jerked forward, lurching in the water as the engine coughed and sputtered, fighting against whatever force had a hold on me. But it wasn't enough. The boat rocked again, harder this time, and I was thrown backward, crashing into the cold, wet floor of the boat with a thud. My vision blurred from the impact, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I fought to regain control, but before I could, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of the water pulling me down. The boat groaned, buckling under the weight of whatever was beneath it. I grabbed the side of the boat with all the strength I had left, pulling myself upright with sheer willpower, my breath ragged and panicked. The creature below was circling. I could feel it, feel the pulse of its movements through the boat. It was so close, so impossibly close, and I could hear the deep, resonant growl again, rumbling from the depths of the lake. The water seemed to vibrate with its presence, the air thick with a terrible, suffocating tension. I yanked the throttle one last time, desperate, my mind screaming for escape. This time, the engine roared to life with a jolt, the boat finally jerking forward with an unsteady lurch. The sound of the motor blasting into action was the sweetest noise I'd ever heard. I could feel the boat moving, gaining speed, the pressure against the hull finally lessening. But it wasn't enough. With a sickening lurch, the boat pitched again, and I saw it, an enormous shape rising from the depths, too massive to comprehend, a colossal shadow breaking through the water. It wasn't just beneath me anymore. It was here. The water churned around me, waves crashing against the boat as the creature's form loomed beneath the surface. I felt a surge of terror like nothing I had ever known, my heart pounding in my chest as I fought to keep the boat moving. But the force beneath was overwhelming, an oppressive weight that threatened to pull me down into the abyss. The engine sputtered. The boat lurched again. The fog swallowed everything, and the rhythmic breathing from below echoed in my ears, louder, closer, a final, warning growl that made my blood run cold. I tried again, but the motor failed me once more, and I was left with nothing but the thundering sound of my own heart and the creature's slow, methodical breathing rising from the depths. And that was when I knew it was too late. The engine sputtered, choking as I desperately twisted the throttle. The boat rocked violently again, a force so powerful it seemed to come from the depths themselves. My hands shook as I gripped the sides of the boat, trying to keep myself steady, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I could feel the weight of the lake pressing in on me, surrounding me, suffocating me. Every breath was shallow, every movement sluggish, as if the very air had turned heavy with dread. Then, as the boat lurched again, I caught it. For the briefest of moments, there was a sudden, eerie stillness, a silence so profound it seemed unnatural, as though even the world around me had held its breath. The motor was silent, the water barely rippling. And in that stillness, my eyes were drawn downward to the water's surface, and I saw it. A shape, vast and dark, rising from the depths. It was like a shadow, but a shadow that didn't belong. It was massive, its form sprawling and fluid, like a serpent, but far too large, far too unnatural to be anything I could comprehend. The surface of the water rippled around it, but it moved with a disturbing grace, its outline stretching beneath the surface, undulating slowly as if testing the waters. It was impossibly long, its sheer size made the boat look like a toy in comparison. It wasn't just the length, though. It was the presence of it, something so ancient, so immense, that it filled my entire field of vision, darkening the water beneath me, like the shadow of a mountain in the deep. The shape twisted, its form bending in a way that defied nature. I could make out a mass of coils, serpentine in shape, but with something else, something much more alien, much more menacing. The sheer power of it rippled through the water, and my heart stuttered in my chest as I realized it wasn't just some massive fish or undersea monster, it was something older, something that had been waiting in the lake for an eternity. The water around it was churning, swirling, as the creature moved, its form more visible now, like the shadow of something out of legend. My breath caught in my throat. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, vanishing back into the depths with a swift, unnatural motion, disappearing into the murk like it had never been there at all. The water smoothed over, the ripples fading into nothing, as if the creature had simply never existed. But it had. I had seen it. I could feel my stomach twist, bile rising in my throat. The reality of what I had just witnessed slammed into me like a freight train. That thing, whatever it was real. And it was here. Beneath me. Watching me. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my body trembling as adrenaline flooded my system. The boat rocked once more, this time with a force that nearly threw me off balance. I couldn't stop the images flashing through my mind, those massive coils, that shadow, the sheer size of it, its impossibility. The fear was a cold, creeping sensation that wrapped around my spine, digging into my very bones. I tried to breathe, tried to think clearly, but the reality of the creature's presence gnawed at me. It's real. It's real. It's in the lake with me. The water was calm again, too calm, almost unnervingly so. The creature was gone, at least for now. But I knew, deep down, that it hadn't gone far. It was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. I couldn't fight it. There was no fighting something like that. Whatever it was, whatever it had been in the lake for countless years, it was beyond my understanding. I was just a speck in its world, and if it wanted me, I was powerless to stop it. The boat lurched again, a low groan coming from beneath me, and I turned sharply, staring into the dark water, waiting, dreading the next movement, the next sign that the creature was close. But nothing came. For a moment, the world seemed to hold still. The fog was thicker now, suffocating, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my breath, shallow and panicked. I was trapped. Alone. And that thing, whatever it was out there, somewhere in the dark waters below. But I didn't have much time. I could feel it in my bones. The lake had given its warning. The creature had shown itself. It wasn't done with me. The weight of the silence felt suffocating. The water around me was eerily still, as though the lake itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next move. I could still feel the tremors of the boat rocking beneath me, the memory of that immense pressure pressing into the hull, as if the lake was claiming its hold on me, not letting go. I had seen it, the creature, vast and unimaginable, and in that fleeting moment, I realized something terrible, something far worse than I had anticipated. I wasn't just in danger. I was being hunted. The thought hit me with a nauseating clarity. I wasn't merely lost on this lake, surrounded by an ancient terror. No, this creature, this thing, had noticed me. It was no longer some nameless shadow in the depths. It had seen me, had sensed my presence, and I now understood, with chilling certainty, that I was no longer just a visitor to the lake. I was prey. My chest tightened, and the world around me seemed to close in. I could still hear the faint rhythm of that deep, resonating breath from below, the pulsating sound that seemed to come from everywhere, pressing in on me from all sides. It wasn't just the creature's breath, it was the heartbeat of the lake itself, the heartbeat of something far older and more powerful than I could have ever imagined. It knew I was here. The boat lurched again, this time more violently than before, snapping me from my daze. My body jerked to one side, my arms flailing for balance as I gripped the side of the boat to steady myself. The water beneath me seemed to shift with a terrible purpose, as if the very surface was alive, moving with intent. I could feel it now, that dark presence, circling beneath the surface, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes, if it had eyes, focused solely on me. It's playing with me. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. I wasn't just stuck in the middle of the lake with some ancient monster. It was deliberately toying with me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had crossed its path, and now I was nothing more than a helpless victim to whatever ancient instincts drove it. I wanted to scream, wanted to throw myself into the water and swim for shore, but the fog was thick, impenetrable, and the distance was too far. The boat, my only means of escape, seemed to be slowing down, the motor sputtering weakly with each attempt I made to accelerate. It felt as if the creature itself was blocking my every move, keeping me tethered here in the middle of the lake, unable to escape. I'm not getting away. That simple truth crashed down on me, and the weight of it nearly crushed me. The panic surged again, but this time it wasn't just fear for my life. It was the growing certainty that no matter what I did, no matter how fast I ran, the creature would always be there, waiting, hunting. I tried to steady my breath, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. I glanced over the side of the boat, half expecting to see the massive, looming shape rise from the depths again. But the water was still, the only movement coming from the slow ripple of my boat's wake. The creature was close, though. I could feel it. And that was the worst part. I wasn't being chased because it was desperate. It wasn't some mindless predator in search of a meal. No. It was playing a game with me, toying with me. It knew I was alone. It knew I was trapped. It had the patience of centuries to wait for me to make a mistake, to slip up, to let my guard down. I was on its turf now, and there was nothing I could do to change that. The fog grew thicker, the shore almost completely invisible now. The lake stretched out endlessly in every direction, an unbroken expanse of water that felt more like an ocean than the familiar, relatively small body of water I had known my entire life. I felt small here, insignificant, like a speck of dust floating in an infinite void. And beneath that water, just out of sight, was it? The creature. The hunter. I have to get out of here. The thought flashed in my mind, the one remaining thought that clung to my panic-stricken brain. I had to escape. I had to get away. I had to survive. But with each passing second, that certainty grew weaker. The boat groaned again, the engine stuttering as if the very lake was sucking the life out of it, and I could feel the creature's presence rising, pushing in on me from every side. There was no more pretending, no more thinking that I could outsmart it or outrun it. This was the endgame. It was a predator that had been here for centuries, and I was nothing more than its next victim. And all I could do was wait, helpless, for it to strike. It was coming, and I was trapped. I don't know why I thought I could escape. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the sheer desperation that clouded my thoughts, but for a fleeting moment, I thought I had a chance. The engine sputtered again, but this time, miraculously, it roared to life, its growl cutting through the silence like a beacon. The sound should have been comforting, but instead, it made the stillness feel more oppressive, more unnatural. The air was heavy, thick with tension, as though the lake itself had become aware of my movement, reluctant to let me leave. Yet, in that moment, I didn't care. The shore was my only goal. The light from the fading day painted a dim glow on the water, and the land seemed impossibly far, as if the distance had stretched just to mock me. I pushed the throttle forward, and the boat surged ahead, slicing through the water. A small sense of relief washed over me. The ripples from the motor spread outward, breaking the unnerving calm of the water. The gentle sway of the boat felt normal, almost reassuring. I was moving away from the creature. I was escaping. But it wasn't long before that false hope began to wither. The water, despite the boat's motion, remained unnaturally still. It wasn't the calm of a quiet lake at dusk. It was the stillness of something waiting. The ripples from the boat's wake quickly faded, swallowed up by the vast emptiness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching, following, waiting for me to let my guard down. I glanced over the side, my heart racing as I tried to force my mind to focus on the shore. The darkness of the lake's depths stretched out before me, an endless black void. It was as though the water itself had become a predator, a living thing that held me in its grasp, unwilling to release me. The boat surged forward, but there was no sound of the motor in the air, no reassuring hum of progress. The noise seemed to vanish into the fog, muffled, distant. The engine ran, but the sound felt wrong. Too quiet. Too hollow. I gripped the wood tighter, trying to shake the unease that had settled into my chest. The lake was vast, too vast. I could be moving forward, but I had no idea if the shore was any closer or if I was simply drifting deeper into the unknown. The fog was thickening again, coiling around me like a living thing, and the farther I went, the more the world shrank into a suffocating tunnel. And then, the water shifted. At first, it was subtle, a small ripple breaking the glassy surface. I thought it was the boat's wake, the movement of the engine beneath me. But as I looked closer, I saw something else. A shadow, stretching beneath the water, long and dark, moving with purpose. It was not a fish or a log, something familiar and benign. No, this shape was different, fluid and deliberate, a presence lurking just out of reach, like a predator waiting to strike. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was just a play of light on the water, the fog playing tricks on my mind. But the whisper of my own fear gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, growing louder, more insistent. The ripples spread further, like an invisible hand testing the water's edge. I forced myself to look ahead, to focus on the shore. It was just there, barely visible through the haze. I could make it. I could escape. But with every moment that passed, the sense of danger pressed tighter, more suffocating. It was as if the lake was closing in on me, narrowing the path to safety. The boat jolted again, but this time it wasn't the motor sputtering or the water shifting beneath the hull. It was a force, a pressure that seemed to come from below. The whole boat lurched sideways, and I nearly lost my grip on the wheel. I slammed my hand down on the throttle, pushing the boat forward with all the strength I had left. But the water resisted, almost as if it were trying to pull me back, to drag me down into its depths. I could hear it now, the faintest of noises, a low hum vibrating through the boat. It wasn't the sound of the engine, nor was it the wind or water. It was deeper, more resonant. It was coming from beneath. A sound almost like breathing. I froze. It was closer. The creature had not left me. It was still here, under the water, stalking me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Panic clawed at me again, but I fought it down. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop. I had to get to shore. The boat surged forward once more, but the sense of the water pressing against me, pushing back, only grew stronger. I glanced over the side once more. The shadow was there again, following me, moving just beneath the surface, a dark presence that seemed to stretch and shift with an intelligence of its own. It was toying with me, playing with me like a cat with its prey. I could hear the breath of the lake grow louder now, rhythmic, deep, like the beating of a heart. I wasn't free. The lake wasn't going to let me go that easily. And that creature, it was still there, waiting for me to make my final mistake. The shore was close, but it felt farther away with every passing second. The false hope that had driven me to start the engine slowly began to fade, replaced by a creeping dread. I wasn't escaping. I was being dragged further in. The boat sped through the water, the engine roaring louder than it had in hours, but the further I went, the more I felt, watched. It wasn't something I could see. There was nothing directly in front of me, no shadowy shape or monstrous form that could be tracking my every move. The water was still again, like a glass mirror that reflected only my fear. The fog had thickened once more, swallowing the shore, turning everything into an indistinct blur. Yet, the sensation never left. It grew stronger with every passing minute. At first, I thought it was just the lingering effects of fear, the kind that clings to you long after the danger has passed, a shadow that follows you even when you can no longer see what's causing it. But this feeling was different. It was visceral, like the pressure of invisible eyes boring into the back of my skull. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I glanced over my shoulder for the 100th time, half expecting to see the dark shape of the creature breaching the surface. But there was nothing. Just water. Just the heavy silence of the lake. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was there. That it was still following me, tracking my every move beneath the surface, just out of sight. I would see a flicker of movement in the water, just out of the corner of my eye, too quick to be real, but always present, like a distortion in the lake's smoothness. The ripples that spread outward from the boat never seemed to disappear. They lingered, swirling, converging in ways they shouldn't. Almost like something was moving with them. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was just being paranoid. That after everything I'd seen, the strange shadows beneath the water, the deep growls that I convinced myself were only the lake's strange echoes, I was now letting fear control my thoughts. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, something told me that the creature wasn't done with me. I could feel it, the slow, calculated pull of its presence. The boat rocked slightly, and I instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The sound of the engine was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I focused on it, forcing myself to listen to the steady hum of the motor as it cut through the water. If I could just keep moving forward, just get to the shore, I'd be okay. But the water, it was too quiet, too still. It didn't feel like it should. I looked out over the side of the boat again, the shadows beneath the surface seeming deeper now, darker. No longer just shapes moving out of the corner of my eye, but actual disturbances in the water. Dark streaks shifting, ripples expanding with no clear cause. Something was there. I knew it. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. My heart skipped a beat as I saw a shadow break the surface, just barely. It was so brief, so fleeting, that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. My breath caught in my throat. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The water beneath me was alive with tension. I could sense it, feel it in my bones. It was like the lake itself had a pulse now, slow, steady, deliberate. My pulse quickened in response, but I forced myself to keep calm. The boat surged ahead, the engine growling, the only sound that felt real. And still, that feeling grew. It was following me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It didn't make sense. What could be following me? I had barely seen the creature, and what little I had glimpsed had seemed so massive, so far beneath the water, that there was no way it could have been tracking me with such precision. And yet, the sensation didn't fade. It was there, a constant pressure in the back of my mind. Like a weight pressing on my shoulders, a gaze I couldn't see but could feel. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to see if something was lurking behind me. But I knew that if I turned my back now, even for a second, I would give it a chance to strike. I glanced around again, my eyes darting across the water, trying to catch a glimpse of any movement, any sign of the creature. The fog had thickened again, the shore barely visible in the distance, a distant blur of dark land. But in the fog, in the stillness, it was as though the lake had swallowed everything, my sight, my sound, my very sense of direction. The boat shuddered again, a small jolt, as if something had brushed up against the hull, just beneath the water's surface. I froze. My hand instinctively jerked the throttle forward, and the boat lurched ahead, pushing faster now. But the cold feeling of being hunted stayed with me. It wasn't just my imagination. The creature was still there. I could feel it, lurking just below the surface, as silent and invisible as the depths of the lake. The water around me rippled, swirling, as though it were responding to something far below. I kept moving, faster now, but with each passing second, the sensation of being followed grew more intense. I was no longer just a man in a boat, trying to get to safety. I was a hunted animal, running from an unseen predator, a force of nature that had been here far longer than I could comprehend. And no matter how fast I went, no matter how hard I pushed the throttle, the creature would be right behind me, always there, always watching, waiting for the moment when I'd make my final mistake. The shore was still out of reach. And I realized, with growing horror, that the creature knew this. It didn't need to chase me, it knew I would come to it. I could feel it now, deeper than ever, the fear that clung to my skin like the damp chill of the lake. The boat surged forward, and with every jolt, every creak of the wood, a part of me started to unravel. The engine's growl was no longer comforting. The rhythmic hum of the motor, which I had once relied on to calm me, now seemed hollow. The longer I kept my eyes fixed on the water, the more I started to doubt everything I knew. Am I really alone out here? The question repeated itself in my mind, over and over, growing louder with each passing second. It was as though the lake itself was alive, breathing, moving, just waiting for me to let my guard down. The shadows beneath the surface, the ripples that weren't caused by my boat, the strange sounds that came and went, the deeper I looked into the water, the more every little thing seemed like a threat. I glanced behind me once more, trying to convince myself that it was only my imagination. That the creature was long gone, that the sense of being hunted was just a product of the terror I had experienced. But the further I went, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Something that was always just out of sight, lurking in the depths, biding its time. I tightened my grip on the wheel, the cold metal biting into my palm. The boat rocked slightly again, the sudden shift making my heart leap into my throat. For a moment, I thought I saw something dart beneath the surface, a flash of dark, serpentine movement. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the water. Still. Unmoving. But I knew I had seen something. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't crazy. The shadows beneath the surface, were they moving toward me? I couldn't tell anymore. The ripples that had once been calm and distant now seemed to stretch farther, reaching, stretching, until they touched the boat. I leaned over the side, eyes scanning frantically for any sign, any clue that could explain the madness I was feeling. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement just below the water's surface. It wasn't a fish, it wasn't a log. This was something different. Long and dark, it slid through the water with a fluidity that was unnerving. My breath caught in my chest, my mind racing. Had it been there the whole time? Had it been tracking me, waiting for me to see it? Or was I just imagining the whole thing? I straightened up quickly, forcing myself to look ahead, to look toward the shore, but it was no use. Every shadow, every ripple, every flicker in the corner of my eye became another potential threat. I couldn't stop myself from seeing it everywhere. In every wave. In every stretch of water. The sound of my own breathing grew louder in my ears, harsh and shallow. My eyes darted back and forth, scanning the water for any sign of the creature. But no matter how much I searched, no matter how much I strained my eyes, there was nothing, just the glassy surface of the lake, reflecting nothing but my fear. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break the silence. But I couldn't. The silence was the only thing I could trust. The sound of my voice would only confirm what I feared the most, that I was truly alone, and it was just me, the boat, and the lake. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake itself was alive, aware of me, toying with me. Every passing second seemed like an eternity, every minute dragging me deeper into my own mind, deeper into the paranoia that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. What if I was being followed? What if the creature was still out there, circling beneath me, watching with those glowing eyes. What if it had never left? My stomach twisted in knots. I wiped my brow with the back of my hand, feeling the sweat, the cold fear seeping through my skin. I was no longer sure what was real. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred. How could I be sure what was under the water and what was just my own mind playing tricks on me? The longer I stayed out here, the more the paranoia crept in, twisting every ripple, every shadow into something more sinister. I shook my head, trying to clear it, trying to focus on getting to the shore, but the doubt lingered. Had I seen something just move beneath the water? Or was it just another trick of the light, another piece of my imagination run wild? The fog had thickened again, and with it, the pressure of the lake seemed to increase. The air felt too thick, too heavy, like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me with each breath. I couldn't let it get to me. I couldn't. I had to focus. But it was hard to think, hard to stay rational, when everything around me seemed to shift. When every shadow seemed like it might move, when every ripple felt like a warning. The boat surged forward, but the lake never gave me any sense of relief. I could still feel it, watching, from beneath, waiting, following me with every motion. No matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was closing in, its presence so oppressive it felt like the water itself was conspiring against me. I looked ahead again, desperate for something real to focus on. But the shore seemed just as far away as it had been when I first started the engine. The lake wasn't letting me go. The creature wasn't letting me go. I was trapped in this nightmare, and the more I struggled, the tide of the water seemed to wrap around me. I was being hunted. And no matter how fast I went, I couldn't escape. The fog rolled in faster than I expected, thick and suffocating, curling around the boat like a living thing. It wasn't like the gentle mist I'd seen earlier, the kind that lingered harmlessly over the water. No, this was different. This fog had weight to it, dense and heavy, as though it had been waiting for the right moment to swallow me whole. It seemed to spread from the center of the lake, thickening around me, obscuring everything in a blur of white-gray. I tried to keep the boat steady, eyes straining through the haze, but the world around me had been reduced to a sliver of visibility just a few feet ahead. The shore, once a distant but comforting line of darkness, was now completely hidden behind the impenetrable fog. I couldn't see anything anymore. The world had shrunk to the boat and the water beneath it, everything else drowned out by the mist. The lake, once so vast, had become a trap, a maze with no walls, no way of telling which direction I was going. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white against the cold metal. The water around me seemed to stretch endlessly, the ripples disappearing into the fog as soon as they formed. I couldn't hear anything but the engine now, and even that felt muffled, as if the fog had wrapped itself around the sound. The eerie stillness was overwhelming. The world had narrowed to nothing more than a small, fragile boat floating in a sea of white nothingness. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, that it was waiting, that it had followed me into the fog, its presence only more potent in this damp, obscured world. It felt closer now, closer than before, but I couldn't see it. I couldn't hear it. It was as if it had blended into the very fog itself, hiding just beneath the surface, its eyes watching me from the depths. I glanced behind me, the haze in every direction blurring into one vast, unbroken sheet. Nothing. Just the swirling mist that seemed to creep closer with each second. The muffled sounds around me only made things worse. There were no birds, no distant boats, no sound of wind rustling the trees along the shore. The world had gone dead silent, like a heavy blanket had been draped over everything. The only thing that remained was the beat of my own pulse in my ears and the rhythmic sound of the engine sputtering ahead, cutting through the water. But even that seemed too loud, too intrusive in this muffled, empty space. And then came the feeling again, the sensation of being watched. It crept up on me, crawling through my skin and wrapping itself around my bones. My breath caught in my throat, and I jerked my head around, trying to pierce the fog with my eyes, searching for any sign, any movement. But there was nothing. Only the fog. Was it getting thicker? I couldn't tell. The fog had completely disoriented me. The distance to the shore was impossible to judge now. Everything seemed so close, and yet so far, as though the fog itself was pushing me deeper into the lake, away from safety. I tried to focus on the engine, on the sound of the water, on something, anything, that would reassure me I wasn't alone. But the fog kept pressing in, thickening with each passing minute. I couldn't hear the water slapping against the sides of the boat. I couldn't hear anything but the beat of my own panicked breathing. It was like the world had swallowed me whole. The lake had become a vast, empty void with no sense of direction or refuge. I was adrift in a world that felt utterly alien, where everything I had known about the water, the shoreline, and the boat seemed meaningless now. The fog was consuming everything, blurring the lines between what was real and what was fear. I wiped my forehead again, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my face. Was this just the fear playing tricks on me, or was the creature still out there, close, its glowing eyes waiting to pierce through the mist and drag me back into the depths? I didn't know. I couldn't be sure of anything anymore. The engine sputtered, a harsh sound that echoed in the stillness, making my heart jump. I glanced down at the dashboard, desperate for a sign, any sign that I was still moving forward. The needle on the fuel gauge wavered, and I realized, with a jolt of panic, that I had no idea how much fuel I had left. I hadn't checked before I left this morning, too caught up in the rush of the day, the promise of catching a big haul. But now, in this fog, it felt like every second was an eternity. How long would I be able to stay out here before I ran out of fuel, before I was stranded in the middle of the lake with it? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away, but the fog was like a fog in my mind as well. Every thought, every rational judgment seemed to dissipate into it, leaving me with nothing but the primal urge to survive. I glanced over the side of the boat again. Nothing. No signs of movement. No ripples in the water. No shadows gliding beneath the surface. But my mind, twisted and overrun with fear, made me question everything. The longer I stayed in this oppressive silence, the more the fog seemed to grow alive, as though it, too, was part of the lake's hidden secrets, an extension of the creature itself. Was the creature in the fog now, silently circling beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when I would lose my nerve? The world was shrinking around me. My chest tightened. And still, the fog pressed in. I wasn't alone out here. And the more the fog thickened, the clearer that truth became. The shore finally appeared through the thick fog, a dark silhouette against the pale haze, distant but real. My heart leaped into my chest as I pushed the boat forward, the engine groaning under the strain, fighting against the drag of the water. I could see the outline of the rocks and trees now, the familiar shapes that marked the edge of the lake, the land that would be my salvation. I was almost there. I was going to make it. I could hardly believe it. The knot in my stomach loosened, just slightly, but it was enough. The shore was close enough now that I could see the movement of the trees, the gentle sway of the branches. The fog began to thin, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I felt the flicker of hope. The boat bounced over the waves with a rhythmic certainty, like it knew we were nearing safety. But then, just as I was about to let my guard down completely, the feeling struck again. It was subtle at first. A shiver down my spine, a prickling sensation across the back of my neck. It was like someone had stepped into the room with me, but I was still alone on the water. I glanced around frantically, searching the fog for any sign of movement, any ripple in the water that could explain the unease creeping over me. Nothing. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just imagining things. The fog had thinned. The shore was right there, close enough to touch. I was going to be fine. I just had to get to land, get out of this boat, and there. A faint ripple caught my eye. Just a flicker beneath the water's surface. The sense of being watched grew more intense, gnawing at my mind like a living thing. I jerked my head around, but all I saw was the shore, growing closer with every second. The boat surged forward, each stroke of the engine pulling me closer to safety. But I couldn't shake it. The ripples were too unnatural, too calculated. The fog had lifted just enough that I could see the lake stretching out around me, but the sensation of something watching me, waiting for me to slip up, hung heavy in the air. It was like the water itself was holding its breath, as though it was waiting for me to make a mistake. The shore was almost within reach. The boat's motor hummed louder, its sound more desperate, as though it knew the danger that lurked beneath. The feeling of being pursued, the feeling that something was just a step behind me, intensified. Was it still there? Was it still following me? I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than the fear, the fog, the isolation playing tricks on me. But I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I could taste the salt of my own sweat on my lips. And then I saw it. A movement in the water. A shadow. Long, serpentine, and unmistakable. It darted beneath the surface, faster than I could react, a blur of dark, sinuous motion that left a trail in the water behind it. I froze, my hand instinctively gripping the wheel harder. My pulse surged in my ears as the image of the creature's massive form flashed before my eyes. It wasn't just in my mind. It was real. I had seen it. It was waiting for me to reach the shore, to think I was safe, so it could take me. The boat rocked again, more violently this time, and I gasped. My breath came in short, panic bursts as I turned to face the shore, still so close, and yet it felt miles away now. The beast beneath the water was still there, just beneath the surface, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I slammed the throttle forward, urging the boat to move faster. The shore was so close. I had to make it. But the feeling didn't leave. The pressure on my chest grew tighter with every second. I could still feel those eyes on me, the weight of its presence stalking me from beneath, as though the lake itself was a living thing, bent on pulling me back down into its depths. I could hear the splash of the water, but it didn't sound normal. It was deeper now, like something massive was shifting just beneath me. The boat shuddered again, more forcefully this time, and the sensation of something brushing against the underside of the boat sent a cold rush of panic through my veins. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let it drag me back. I pushed forward, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to focus on nothing but the shore, the land I was almost at, the safety that seemed to be just within reach. But even as I neared, even as the shoreline became more distinct, the dread still clung to me. The sensation of being watched grew unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake had already claimed me. The moment I reached land, it would take me, just like it had taken so many others. The shore was no escape. It was all too late. I was still trapped. The boat scraped against the rocky shoreline with a harsh grind, and I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sound. It had never felt like such a violent, jarring noise before, and yet in that moment, it was the most welcome sound I'd ever heard. I was on land again. I cut the engine, the whirring sound slowly fading away, leaving only the quiet. But it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a dead quiet, thick with something I couldn't quite place. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong, about this moment. I stood there, staring at the shore, my heart still racing in my chest, a distant echo of panic that wouldn't leave. The boat slowly drifted toward the rocks, nudging gently against them with each small wave, but I barely noticed. My mind was caught on a strange feeling that clung to the air, a sense of something still following me, even though I was now safely on solid ground. I grabbed the oars, pulling the boat further up on the shore, my movements mechanical, unthinking. The last few hours on the water felt like a blur, the images of the creature, the fog, the weight of being hunted, all crashing into each other in my mind. But one thing stood out clearly: I had survived. I had made it back. I tried to take a deep breath, to calm myself, but the air felt thick, like the fog still hadn't entirely let go of me. I looked around, searching for something familiar to ground me, but the scene before me only intensified the feeling of disorientation. The town, once lively and full of activity, seemed eerily still. The houses sat quietly on the hillside, their windows dark, no lights on, no movement. The streets, which should have been bustling with the usual sounds of life, cars passing by, people talking, kids playing, were completely silent. Not even a single bird chirped from the trees. It was wrong. I knew this town. I had lived here my whole life. The morning after a storm would usually bring a quiet calm, but this felt different. This felt as if the town was empty. Like the life had been drained from it, leaving it hollow. I dragged the boat further up the rocky beach and tied it off. My legs felt unsteady, as though the solid ground beneath me wasn't as firm as it should be. A part of me wanted to turn back, to get back on the water, to escape whatever feeling had settled over me. But I couldn't. I was too far in, too deep into this nightmare to run away from it now. I glanced back at the water, the dark surface reflecting nothing but the cold, gray sky above. The lake was calm now, unnaturally so. It was the same lake I had fished countless times before, but now it felt like a different world. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence that pressed against my chest. The shore that had seemed like safety now felt like the edge of a trap. I turned away from the water, my boots crunching against the gravel, and made my way toward the town. The houses loomed in the distance, their dark windows staring at me like empty eyes, waiting for me to enter. I stepped onto the main street, and again, I felt it, the stillness. It was so complete, so absolute, that it was almost suffocating. I couldn't hear the sound of my own footsteps, only the distant, ever-present thrum of my pulse in my ears. The street lights were off, casting everything in a dim, unnatural gray. It was like walking through a ghost town. I had never seen it like this before. I paused in the middle of the street, looking down at the quiet houses, the empty shops, the places that should have been full of life. But the longer I stood there, the more something gnawed at me, deep in my gut. It was as if the town had been abandoned, not just for the night, but for good. The street was empty, and yet I had the distinct feeling that someone, something, was watching me from behind the walls. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising tide of panic. I told myself that it was just the aftermath of the terror I had faced on the lake, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything I had been through. But even as I tried to reason with myself, The dread clung to me, the same as it had on the water, as though I was being hunted once again. I turned toward the local diner, the one place I knew would still be open, where I could find some semblance of normalcy, even if only for a moment. But as I approached, the same eerie quiet pressed in. The diner's sign hung limply above the door, its neon lights unlit. It wasn't just closed, it was abandoned. The windows were dark, and the door, usually left ajar even late into the night, was firmly shut. I tried the door handle, but it didn't budge. My heart skipped a beat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I backed away, the sensation of being watched growing stronger, more oppressive, like invisible eyes were tracking my every move. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, why everything felt so wrong, why the lake had felt like a death sentence, and why this town, my home, seemed to be suffocating under an invisible weight. I turned and headed toward the old dock, the one that jutted out into the lake near the edge of the town. I had to check it one more time. Something deep inside me told me that if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to rest. That the answers, if there were any, could only be found at the place where all this had started. And though I was sure I had left the nightmare behind, the dread followed me as I walked. It was there in the air, in the silence, in the empty streets. It never let go. Something had changed. Something had followed me back from the lake. The dock wasn't far from the diner, just a few blocks down the street, but every step I took felt like I was moving through a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. The heavy silence pressed down around me, and I couldn't shake the sensation that the town, my town, was holding its breath. It was as if the entire place was waiting for something, but I couldn't figure out what. I reached the dock, but the sight of it, just like everything else, only added to the confusion. The familiar stretch of wood, the old fishing boats that usually littered the edge, the smell of salt and fresh water in the air, all of it seemed to belong to a different world. The dock was empty now, like the rest of the town. No fishermen. No boats bobbing in the water. The place I had known my whole life now seemed foreign, alien, as if I had walked into some twisted version of it. I stood there for a moment, staring out at the lake, the fog still hanging low in the distance, just beyond the horizon. The water looked calm, too calm, like a vast sheet of glass hiding whatever horrors lay beneath. I thought of the creature, its massive, glowing eye, the unnatural pull it had on me, and how it seemed to stalk me from the depths. My stomach churned. I needed answers, or at the very least, reassurance that I hadn't imagined everything. I had to find someone who had seen what I had seen, someone who could tell me I wasn't going mad. I turned away from the water, my eyes scanning the empty street. There had to be someone around here, someone who could give me some kind of explanation. I walked quickly, trying to push away the creeping sense of dread that kept tightening its grip around me. I passed a few houses, still dark, still silent, but as I neared the small grocery store, I spotted a figure through the window. A man, hunched over a counter, staring blankly at the register. I couldn't make out his face, but I knew he lived here. I had seen him around the lake before. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling, and the man looked up, startled. His eyes flickered with something I couldn't place. Fear? Recognition? He quickly wiped his face, as if trying to erase some emotion that had crossed over him. "Morning," I said, my voice hoarse, like I hadn't spoken in hours. The man nodded, but his gaze was wary. I could see the unease in his posture, the way his hands shook slightly as he folded a newspaper. I wasn't sure if he was nervous because of me or something else. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and strained. I glanced around the store as if hoping someone else might be there to answer my questions. But no one was. Has anything strange been happening around here lately? I asked, trying to sound casual, but my words came out more urgent than I had intended. He paused, his eyes darting toward the back of the store, then back to me. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. What do you mean by strange? His voice was tight, and there was something in his tone that made me uneasy. I glanced toward the door, then back at him. The lake. I've seen some things. Strange shapes in the water, things I can't explain. Have you seen anything like that? His face darkened, and for a moment I thought he might turn away, refuse to talk. But then, almost as if he couldn't help himself, he nodded. You're not the first one, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. People around here, people who live close to the lake, they've been talking about it for months now. Strange things in the water. Figures, shadows, glowing eyes. It's not just you. My breath caught in my throat, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. What do you mean? What figures? The man wiped his forehead, then glanced nervously toward the back again. He looked around as if making sure no one else was listening. There's been rumors, he began, his voice shaky. Fishermen, people who've been out on the water alone, they talk about seeing things, big things, moving beneath the surface. Some say they saw a giant serpent-like creature, others say it was something worse. The old-timers, they've been telling stories about it for years. But lately, more people have been seeing it. And no one knows what it is or what it wants. I felt a chill spread through me as his words sank in. The creature. The thing that had stalked me. It wasn't just me. Other people had seen it. It was real. But it's not just the lake, the man continued, his voice dropping even lower. It's the town, too. People are disappearing. Not just disappearing, but it's like they're vanishing. Like they never existed. Some folks say they see things in their houses, in their windows at night, shadows, or figures standing just outside. No one talks about it openly, but you can feel it. People are scared. They're afraid to go near the lake, afraid to even leave their homes after dark. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. This wasn't just about me. This was happening to everyone. I wasn't alone. And whatever was happening, whatever had come back from the lake, it was getting worse. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. Have any of the others actually seen what's in the water? The man looked around again, his face pale. I don't know if they've seen it, but they've seen enough. I've seen enough. The lake, it changes. It watches. He paused, then added in a hushed voice, some of us believe it's feeding off us. Off our fear. Or maybe it's something worse. Something that's been here longer than we know. I stared at him, my mind reeling with the implications of his words. This wasn't a coincidence. The creature, the lake, the disappearing people, it was all connected. And whatever was happening, whatever had been unleashed, wasn't finished yet. I took another step closer, my voice barely a whisper. What can we do? How do we stop it? The man's face twisted with a bitter kind of sadness. I don't know. But it's coming for us all, one way or another. I felt the weight of his words settle on me, the horrifying realization that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And I wasn't sure if I had the strength to stop it. I stepped out of the grocery store, the man's words still echoing in my head. The weight of what he had told me was suffocating, pressing down on me like a storm cloud I couldn't escape. There were too many pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit, and every time I tried to put them together, they seemed to slip further apart. The air felt colder now, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around me as I walked aimlessly down the street, trying to make sense of everything. I had to convince myself it was all just a series of coincidences. My mind was playing tricks on me. It was just my nerves, my fear, getting the best of me. That's all it was. I had been out on the water for hours, alone, battling the uncertainty of the lake and the shadows beneath it. It was easy to let my imagination get away from me. The human mind can do that, especially when you're in the midst of isolation. It can take the smallest things and blow them up into something monstrous. A large fish, maybe? A shadow cast by a passing boat, or even the way the fog had played tricks on my eyes. There had been no real sign of a creature. Just ripples, deep sounds, and a brief glimpse of something large moving beneath the water. Could it have been something natural? A giant sturgeon, maybe? I scoffed under my breath, trying to laugh at myself. It was ridiculous, of course. I had been on this lake my whole life. I knew every ripple, every current. There was nothing there. Nothing that could have explained the overwhelming sense of being watched. Nothing that could have explained the growing dread that had consumed me. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, a shiver ran down my spine. The image of that glowing eye, staring at me from the depths, refused to leave my mind. No fish, no matter how large, and eyes that big, no fish would send the kind of icy chill through my body that I had felt in that moment. No fish could pull a boat like that, dragging it, forcing me to fight for control. No fish could make me feel like I was being hunted. I stopped in my tracks, standing in front of the old church at the end of the street. The bell tower loomed over me, the gray sky casting shadows over the stone. I felt a strange pull toward it, like something inside me was urging me to find answers, to fix what had happened. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew there was no rational explanation for what I had experienced. I couldn't write it off as a bad dream or a trick of the mind. The creature was real. It wasn't just a large fish or a prank. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the memories, the dark water, the deep growl that reverberated through my chest, the way the lake seemed to shift as if it was alive, aware of my presence. I had been alone out there. Alone in the middle of the lake, with no one to back up my story, no one to help me make sense of it. I had no way of knowing if anyone else had seen it. No one to share in the fear. The fear that I wasn't just imagining things. That something, someone, had been out there with me. Watching me. Waiting for me. I opened my eyes and stared down at my hands, now trembling slightly. The rational part of my mind tried to regain control, telling me to pull myself together. I could still make sense of this. I could still explain it away. But as I stood there in the cold, silent street, I knew deep down that there was no way to explain what I had felt. I had seen something. I had felt something. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere, beneath the water, lurking, waiting. The town, with its strange silence and emptiness, seemed to reinforce that fear. People didn't just vanish. There were no coincidences. No explanation could account for the way the lake had changed, for the way the shadows had twisted and shifted, as if alive. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever was out there, it wasn't finished. It wasn't going to let me, or anyone else, go that easily. I turned away from the church and walked back toward the lake, unable to fight the pull of the water. If I could just see it again, maybe I could prove to myself it was all just in my head. Maybe I could find some logical reason for what I had seen, some explanation to quiet the panic gnawing at the back of my mind. But the deeper I thought about it, the more I realized there was no way to explain it. Not now. Not ever. And that's when the fear truly took hold. Not the fear of what I had seen, but the fear of what was still there, waiting for me, watching from the depths. The night was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was a silence that hung heavy in the air, like the calm before a storm, and as I lay in bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My thoughts kept drifting back to the lake, to the thing I had seen, to the crushing pressure of being hunted by something I couldn't even fully comprehend. I tossed and turned, the sheets twisted around me as I tried to escape the suffocating dread that had settled in my chest. But sleep, when it finally came, brought no relief. If anything, it brought me closer to the thing I feared the most. The dream started slowly, at first nothing more than a vague unease, a sense that I was not alone. The lake appeared before me, vast and dark, the surface perfectly still. But beneath that calm exterior, I could feel the weight of something. A pressure, like a shadow, stretching out beneath the water, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stood at the edge of the dock, just as I had earlier in the day, but now it felt wrong. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the same cold feeling I had experienced when the creature had been near. And then it happened. A ripple broke the stillness. Just one small disturbance in the water. But that was all it took. Suddenly, the surface of the lake exploded outward, as if something massive was pushing against it from below. The water rose up, spraying into the air, and I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it, a massive, glowing eye, piercing through the surface, locked onto me with a cold, predatory gaze. The eye was enormous, almost too large, its irises swirling with an unnatural light. It saw me. It knew I was there. And in that moment, I knew deep down that there was no escape. Before I could move, the water surged forward, grabbing me, pulling me into its depths. The pressure was unbearable, like 1,000 hands wrapping around my legs, dragging me down into the blackness. I tried to scream, but the water filled my mouth, choking me, drowning me. The coldness of it, the vast, inescapable coldness, was suffocating. I could feel the thing circling beneath me, its presence so heavy I could almost touch it. Something massive, its form too large to comprehend, moved just beneath my feet. It was hunting me, waiting for me to slip just a little further into its grasp. I kicked and thrashed, my limbs fighting against the current, but it was useless. The more I struggled, the tighter the grip of the water became. My lungs burned as I gasped for air that wouldn't come, and in that moment, I knew I was going to die here. Then, in an instant, the creature struck. I felt its cold, scaly body brush against my leg, and before I could react, it lunged, its massive jaws opening wide, swallowing me whole. And just as its teeth sank into me, I woke up with a start. I shot up in bed, my heart racing, sweat pouring down my face. My body was trembling, and I could still feel the phantom sensation of the creature's jaws around me, even though I was safely back in my room. The room was dark, the only sound the heavy thudding of my own breath. I fumbled for the light, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and when the bulb flickered on, I breathed a sigh of relief. But that relief didn't last long. The same feeling, the feeling of being watched, was still there, hanging in the air around me, thick and suffocating. I looked around the room, half expecting to see a shadow, a dark figure lurking in the corner. My eyes darted to the window, but it was just the moonlight, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. Yet, despite the normalcy of it, I couldn't shake the fear that the nightmare had somehow followed me out of the dream world and into the waking one. The cold sweat on my skin hadn't dried, and my pulse still raced in my ears. I tried to calm myself, to remind myself that it was just a dream, just a result of the stress, the fear I'd been living with since that day on the lake. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I had felt it. The thing from the lake, whatever it wasn't just something I had imagined. It was real. It was still out there. And it wasn't done with me yet. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My breath was shallow as I lay back down, trying to shake off the terror that clung to me like a second skin. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the gnawing certainty in my gut. The creature was still waiting. And it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. Days passed, but the feeling never left. It clung to me like the weight of a storm cloud overhead, darkening everything in its path. I couldn't sleep without remembering the cold, the pressure, the pull of the water, the eyes that haunted my dreams. I couldn't even walk through town without glancing at the lake, half expecting the water to stir, for something to emerge from the depths, watching me. And yet, in the midst of all that fear, there was something else. A strange, undeniable pull, a compulsion I couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. It was as though the lake itself was calling to me, whispering my name, luring me back to it, back to the thing that I had seen. I had to know more. I needed to understand what it was, what I had encountered in those dark waters. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't just the need to prove that I hadn't imagined it. There was something deeper, a hunger growing inside me. The same hunger that drives a person to return to a dangerous cliff, to peer over the edge and risk everything. Even now, after everything I'd been through, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to go back. I couldn't stop myself from needing answers. I found myself walking to the shore almost every evening, staring out across the lake as if I could will the creature to surface again, to show itself to me. But no matter how long I waited, no matter how hard I stared, the water remained as still and silent as it had been that day. The locals had stopped talking to me, no longer offering their warnings, their fearful glances. I was alone in my obsession, trapped in the pull of the lake. Every time I tried to tell myself it was over, that I had seen something that wasn't real and that I should move on, my mind rebelled. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, more that I hadn't seen yet. I started to do research. Books, articles, old newspaper clippings, anything that might shed some light on what I had experienced. I spent hours at the local library, scanning through dusty pages and yellow clippings, searching for any mention of strange sightings, mysterious disappearances, or even just folklore. Anything that might tie together the fragments of my own experience. It didn't take long before I started to find patterns. The first mention came from a report from the early 1920s, a fisherman who claimed to have seen something massive beneath the water, something that followed his boat. Then another, from the late 50s, told of strange waves and ripples in the water, like something was moving just beneath the surface, unseen. The more I read, the more I found. Disappearances, odd encounters, strange occurrences all around the lake. Some of them were written off as accidents, others as pure superstition. But the more I dug, the more the pieces started to fit together. It wasn't just me. This thing had been here long before I had even stepped foot on that boat. It had been waiting, watching, hunting. And now, it had me. I couldn't explain why, but something inside me knew that I had to return to the water. I had to face it again. Part of me feared what I might find, but a larger part of me wanted to see it all, the thing from the depths, the creature that had haunted my every waking thought since that first encounter. I had to know its nature, its purpose. Why had it shown itself to me? Why had it let me live? The town was quieter now, and I could sense their fear that I was too far gone, that I had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. They didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen what I had seen. They hadn't felt the weight of its presence, the suffocating cold of the water as it pulled me under. They hadn't been watched. So, I stopped talking to them. I stopped trying to convince myself that I was crazy, that it had all been a trick of the mind. I was done with all that. The obsession had taken hold, and there was no escaping it. The creature from the lake was a part of me now, just as much as the fear, the memories, and the nightmares. One evening, after another long day of research and restless thinking, I found myself standing at the edge of the water once again. The sun was setting, casting a red glow across the horizon, and the lake seemed calm, almost inviting. The silence was oppressive, but I didn't mind it. The more I stood there, the more I realized this wasn't the lake I had known for years. Not anymore. It was something else now, something darker, something alive. And I knew it was out there, watching me. A low growl seemed to vibrate in the back of my mind, and I snapped my head to the side, scanning the water. Nothing. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. It was a fool's errand. I knew that. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't stop the pull, the need to see it, to understand it, to confront it. And as I stood there, staring out at the still water, I felt it, that feeling again. The presence. The thing that had followed me since the moment I set foot on the boat that day. It was waiting. And, somehow, I was ready to face it. I could feel it. This was just the beginning. The obsession had taken root, and nothing would stop me from uncovering the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. I spent the next several days buried in research, scouring every scrap of information I could find. The library, once a place of quiet solitude, had become my battlefield, each book and article another weapon in the fight for understanding. The townspeople had long since stopped trying to warn me. They didn't need to. They knew that once someone was consumed by curiosity about the lake, it was only a matter of time before they ventured too far. The first thing I looked for were the legends. Old stories, whispered warnings passed down from generation to generation. I was aware that people often exaggerated, especially when it came to places like Lake Erie, mysterious, vast, and filled with secrets. But there was something about these tales, something real beneath the surface. In the dusty corners of the library, I found an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. It was filled with accounts of strange occurrences around the Great Lakes, written by explorers and settlers who had come long before me. But one particular entry caught my eye, an obscure mention of a serpent-like creature in the depths of Lake Erie. The account was written by a man named William Croft, an early settler of the area, and it described an event that occurred in the late 1800s. Croft spoke of sightings of a great serpent, a creature so massive that it could make even the most experienced fisherman turn tail. Croft's descriptions were vague, but the word serpent stood out. He said that the creature's form was rarely seen, but its presence was unmistakable. The water would ripple unnaturally, and the boat would shift, as if something large was moving beneath the surface. The more I read, the more stories I uncovered, whispers of the beast, the serpent, or even the shadow from people who had lived and worked on the lake for generations. Each story was more disturbing than the last. Some spoke of the thing dragging boats under, others of entire crews disappearing without a trace. The stories didn't all match up, but the common thread was undeniable. Something massive, something powerful, something alive beneath the water. I found more details about the creature's nature in a later text, a collection of old folklore gathered by a local historian named Martha Vance. According to the stories she had collected, the creature was not just a mindless predator, it had a purpose, a reason for its actions. The legend spoke of an ancient being that lived in the deepest part of the lake, a creature tied to the land, to the waters, to the very spirit of the earth. Some said it was a guardian, others claimed it was a cursed soul bound to the lake, doomed to hunt anyone who ventured too close. I couldn't help but be drawn to the idea of it being something older than anything I had ever imagined. Something ancient and unknowable. The thought that this beast might be more than a mere creature, that it could have some purpose, some ancient connection to the lake, sent a shiver down my spine. But as I read more, I started to realize something. There were more than just old stories of this creature. Some of the reports, particularly those from the 1900s, were more recent, and they were disturbingly similar to what I had experienced. Fishermen reported hearing deep growls from the depths, seeing strange shapes beneath the water, and feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. But there were other reports that had made my blood run cold: disappearances, boats found adrift with no sign of their occupants, strange, swirling whirlpools where nothing had been before. I kept reading, trying to force myself to dismiss the idea of some kind of supernatural being. But the more I read, the more I realized I was only fooling myself. There was something in the water. Something real. Something that had been there long before I came along, and something that was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting. The final piece of the puzzle came from an old photograph tucked away in the back of the book. It was a blurry, grainy image, barely recognizable, but there, just beneath the water's surface, was a shape. The outline of something massive, long, and serpentine. It was hard to tell what it was, but the shape matched the descriptions of the creature that had been passed down through the years. It was the same shape I had seen with my own eyes, the same form I had glimpsed in the depths of the lake that day. I stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, the weight of it sinking in. The creature wasn't just some local legend or a trick of the mind. It was real. It had been seen before, and it would be seen again. It wasn't just some random anomaly of nature. It had a purpose. It had a reason to exist in those dark waters, and I had been foolish enough to stumble into its territory. I leaned back in the chair, my head spinning. I had learned more than I had ever expected, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. I needed to know what I was dealing with. I needed to understand what had made me its prey, what I had seen, and more importantly, what it wanted. I couldn't stop now. I had gone too far down this rabbit hole to turn back. Something inside me screamed to leave the lake behind, to let go of the obsession, but that was no longer possible. I was trapped, caught in the creature's pull, drawn back to the water like a moth to the flame. I had uncovered the beast's identity, its history. But I knew there was still so much more to learn. And, in the back of my mind, I wondered if the creature knew I was coming for it, if it was watching me right now, waiting for the moment to strike. The creature had been there for centuries. It had survived, unseen, untouchable. But now, I was a part of its story. And soon, I would learn just how far its reach really extended. The sun was setting as I closed the last book I could find on the subject, my mind a whirlwind of theories, ancient lore, and unsettling details. I sat in the library, the weight of the creature's reality pressing on me like an invisible force, but I could not shake the feeling that something was missing. As though there was one last piece of the puzzle I needed to hear. I didn't expect to find it that day. The library doors creaked open, and the faint scent of the outdoors wafted in. I turned to see an older man step inside, his face withered and sunken, the kind of man who had seen too many things and lived through even more. He was tall, with a grizzled beard and calloused hands that had spent decades working the waters of Lake Erie. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I thought he would simply walk past me, dismissing me as just another curious outsider. But then, without a word, he approached the counter where I was sitting. "You're looking for answers, huh?" His voice was low and gravelly, the kind of voice that comes from years of shouting over the roar of the lake. I nodded, not entirely sure how to respond. There was something in his gaze, something ancient and knowing, that made me hesitate before speaking. "I've heard the stories too," he continued, his voice softening. "Everyone who spends enough time out there does. But there's a price to pay for that knowledge, son." I frowned, a chill running down my spine as his words echoed in my head. I hadn't shared anything about what I had been researching, so how could he know? He sat down beside me, his weathered eyes staring off as if reliving something long buried. "I've been fishing these waters my whole life," he said slowly, as though weighing each word. "But I learned the hard way that some things aren't meant to be found." I leaned in slightly, my curiosity piqued despite the growing unease in my chest. "A few years ago, I was out on the lake, like I always am. Clear day. No clouds. Just the hum of the boat's engine and the water slapping against the hull. I thought it'd be another easy haul." He paused, eyes narrowing as if he was mentally transporting himself back to that moment. But then, the water started acting strange. I sat quietly, urging him to continue. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance, as though trying to recall something too frightening to remember. "It started with the ripples," he said, his voice distant. "Not like the usual ones. No, these were different. Too big, too deep. I thought it was just a current. But then the boat began to shake, just a little at first. And that's when I felt it, a pull, a pressure, like something was dragging me down to the bottom." His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles widening. "Then, I saw it," he whispered. "A shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or the water, but no, this thing, it was moving beneath the surface. Massive, like a wall of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. I tried to turn the boat around, but I couldn't. It was like the water itself was keeping me there. I could feel the weight of it, the eyes watching me, just beneath the surface. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as if the fear was somehow contagious. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly, as if he was still reliving the terror. "It wasn't just a shadow, kid," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was something alive. Something that didn't belong in those waters. I could feel it, like it was waiting for something. I don't know how long I stayed there, but it was like the whole lake was holding its breath. And then I saw it rise. A massive shape rising from the depths. It wasn't just big, it was enormous. Long, like a serpent, but with something else, something wrong about it." He closed his eyes, as though the image still haunted him. I sat there, silent, my heart racing. "Did you see its eyes?" I asked before I could stop myself, my voice barely above a whisper. The fisherman looked at me sharply, his eyes wide. You saw them too, didn't you? He asked, his tone dark with recognition. The eyes. You felt them. Watching you, from the deep. That's how it knows. You're not the first to see it, but you might be the last. I shivered, his words ringing in my ears like an omen. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, the cold realization settling in. It wasn't just a creature. It was a force. A force that could hunt, that could track, and, worst of all, it could wait. I didn't know how to respond, my mind racing. What happened? I asked, dreading the answer. The fisherman sighed heavily. I don't know. I don't remember how I got back to shore. All I know is I barely made it. The boat was a wreck. The engine was fried, and the hull had been scraped, like something had tried to tear it apart. I've seen some things on this lake, storms, currents, the usual dangers, but nothing like that. That thing was real. And it was hungry. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto mine. Listen, kid, if you've got any sense at all, you'll walk away from this. I don't care how many books you read or how much history you uncover. Some things don't need to be understood. They need to be left alone. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? I had already come too far. The creature, whatever it was, had already claimed a piece of me. And I was certain that I couldn't let it go. I can't, I muttered under my breath. I can't stop. The fisherman studied me for a moment, his face a mix of pity and fear. Then you're already lost, he said, standing up and turning toward the door. Good luck. You'll need it. As the door closed behind him, I sat there, feeling the weight of his warning settle over me like a shroud. He had spoken the truth, and yet I couldn't walk away. The pull of the lake, of the creature, was too strong. And soon, I would return. There would be no escaping it now. I couldn't shake the fisherman's warning. The more I tried to push it aside, the more the words gnawed at me. It was clear now, what I had seen wasn't a figment of my imagination. I was not the first to encounter the creature, nor would I be the last. But there was still so much I didn't know. So much about what it was, why it existed, and what it truly wanted. Determined to find the answers, I returned to the library the next day, my mind racing with the possibilities. I needed to learn more. To understand what kind of creature could survive in Lake Erie for centuries, hidden from the world, hunting the unwary who dared to venture too far. I dove deeper into the dusty archives, searching for anything that might shed light on the creature's origins. At first, it seemed like a wild goose chase. Folklore, myths, and hearsay. Tales of serpents, water demons, and cursed lakes. Nothing concrete, nothing that gave me the details I craved. But then, I found it, a story buried in an old maritime journal from the early 1800s. The handwriting was faded, almost illegible, but the words seemed to jump off the page, as though they had been waiting to be uncovered. The story was told by a man who had traveled the Great Lakes, a seasoned sailor who had seen his fair share of strange things. He spoke of a time when the waters of Lake Erie had been far more treacherous than they were now. Fishermen and travelers would disappear without a trace, and the locals would whisper in hushed tones about the lake's curse. There are things beneath the waters, the sailor wrote. Things that were here long before us, and things that will remain long after we're gone. We call them the Wraiths of Erie, but that is just a name we gave to something we could not understand. Something ancient. The journal went on to describe a creature, large, serpentine, with glowing eyes that could see through the murky depths of the water. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, not entirely. Some said it was a remnant of an older world, a being that had existed since the earth itself was young. A creature of the deep, one that had adapted to the darkness of the lake, feeding off the fear and life force of those who ventured too far from the shore. The journal described how the creature would stalk its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. It could sense the fear of its victims, growing stronger the more they resisted or tried to escape. The sailor wrote that those who encountered the creature were not just taken, they were drawn into its lair, deep beneath the surface of the lake, where they would remain, lost to time, never to be seen again. As I read those words, I felt a shiver run down my spine. This wasn't just a myth or a legend. It was a warning that I had ignored at my peril. The creature didn't just hunt its victims, it trapped them, pulling them into the depths, where they would become part of its endless hunger. But what terrified me even more was the description of what happened to those who were taken. The sailor wrote that the creature didn't just consume them, it changed them. Those who returned, if they were ever found, were never the same. Their minds were broken, their bodies twisted by the depths they had been dragged into. And that's when the truth hit me. This was no ordinary predator. It was something ancient, something that existed on a level far beyond our understanding. A force of nature, something that could not be fought or reasoned with. It had existed for centuries, waiting for those foolish enough to venture too far. My heart pounded in my chest as I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The realization was like a cold fist around my throat. I had been playing a dangerous game, and I wasn't sure if I could win. The creature was real. And it was still out there, waiting. It had seen me, had marked me, and now I was part of its eternal cycle. The thought consumed me, gnawing at my sanity. I had tried to rationalize everything, to explain it away as a trick of the mind, but there was no denying it anymore. The Beast of Erie was not just a story, it was the truth. And now, I was caught in its web. As I sat there, staring at the journal, I heard a faint noise from outside. A soft, rhythmic sound, like the creaking of wood on water. I stood up, my pulse quickening. It was a sound I knew all too well, the sound of a boat rocking gently in the lake. But it wasn't coming from the harbor. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest, the air thick with the weight of everything I had just discovered. The lake stretched out before me, still and silent, as though it were holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. The truth was undeniable now. It wasn't just a predator. It was a part of the lake itself, a force that would never leave, never let go. And I was already too deep. There was no turning back now. I couldn't just walk away. The warnings, the terror, the truth that had been laid bare before me, it all pushed me forward, deeper into the unknown. Fear gripped my chest, but it wasn't the kind of fear that makes you freeze in place. It was the kind of fear that drives you to act, to face the thing that haunts your every thought. I had to know. I had to see it again, face it, and prove to myself that it was real. I had to confront the creature, no matter the cost. There was no turning back. The lake had already claimed a part of me, and the only way to reclaim it was to meet this ancient terror head-on. The day after I found the journal, I went into town, my mind set on what I needed to do. I spent hours at the local fishing supply store, gathering everything I thought I might need: ropes, knives, flares, extra gas for the boat, and every piece of survival gear I could find. But there was one item that caught my eye, a harpoon. It was a long, rusted thing, clearly not meant for the usual fishing expeditions of the lake. It had a brutal, almost ancient look to it, as though it had seen its fair share of battles. I didn't know if it would even make a dent in the creature, but it was my only hope. I bought the harpoon. With my gear packed, I made my way to the dock. The sun was setting again, casting an orange glow over the water. The lake seemed to stretch endlessly before me, its surface so still it looked like glass. It was the same lake I had fished on countless times, the lake I knew so well. But today, it was different. It was as if the water itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stood at the edge of the dock for a moment, staring out at the lake. There was a weight in the air, a tension I couldn't explain. It felt as though the water was watching me, waiting. The memory of the creature's massive, glowing eyes flashed in my mind, and I shook my head to clear it. I had no room for fear now, only determination. I started the engine of the boat, the familiar hum of the motor filling the silence. The boat jerked forward, cutting through the water, and I pushed away from the shore. As I moved further out, the town behind me began to fade, swallowed up by the vastness of the lake. The soft rocking of the boat was the only sound I could hear, and it seemed to echo louder in the stillness. I thought back to the fisherman's story. The creature had hunted him, had tracked him, had watched him, and he had barely escaped. I could still hear his voice warning me, telling me to turn back. But I couldn't. I was already too far in. The further I went, the more my anxiety grew. Every ripple in the water, every shift in the air, felt like a signal, a message from the lake itself. I glanced over the side of the boat, searching the murky depths for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty water stretching out beneath me. Hours seemed to pass, but I couldn't stop now. I couldn't turn back. The lake was silent, too silent, and the stillness was maddening. I kept the boat moving forward, slowly, cautiously, but it felt as though the water was sucking me deeper into its grip. And then I saw it. A ripple, deep and unsettling, spread across the surface of the lake. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but it grew, expanding outward, as if something massive was moving just beneath the water. My heart skipped a beat. I had been expecting it, but I wasn't prepared for how it would feel. I gripped the harpoon, my fingers tight around the handle. My breath caught in my throat as the ripple turned into something more, something darker, something that was moving toward me. The water split open. Slowly, at first, as if the lake itself was parting, revealing the monstrous shape beneath the surface. My stomach churned, and I felt the blood drain from my face. It was real. It wasn't just a myth or a trick of the mind. This thing, this creature, was alive, and it was coming for me. The water around the boat began to churn violently. The ripple turned into a swell, a wave of force that knocked me off balance. I fought to stay on course, but it was clear that whatever was underneath was far bigger than I had imagined. I could see the shadow of its form, a massive, serpentine shape rising from the depths. Its eyes, those glowing, ominous eyes, were fixed on me, piercing through the water with a malevolent intensity that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I had never felt so small, so powerless. But I couldn't back down now. I was too far gone, and I had come here to face it. I aimed the harpoon toward the water, my grip tightening around the handle as I prepared for the confrontation. The boat rocked again, more violently this time, as the creature neared. The surface of the water began to bubble, as if it were coming alive with anticipation. I took a deep breath, my heart racing. There was no turning back. This was it. The creature was no longer a myth, it was real, and it was ready to fight. I could only hope that I was ready too. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was calling to me, pulling me back in. The moment I had made up my mind to confront the creature, it had felt like a decision I was forced to make, like it was always meant to happen. Now, as the boat rocked gently against the dock, I realized that there would be no true escape from the lake, no leaving this thing behind. I had come this far, and there was only one way to find peace. The morning after gathering my gear and preparing myself for what lay ahead, I made my way back to the water. The sky had darkened, and the wind had picked up, but something else felt different, something I couldn't place. A heaviness in the air, a kind of stillness, like the world was holding its breath. The fog rolled in faster than I expected. I stepped into the boat again, each creak of the hull feeling louder than it should have. The motor hummed to life, but it was quieter than I remembered, almost swallowed by the thick fog that surrounded me now. It had appeared out of nowhere, almost as if it had been waiting for me. The usual familiar sights of the lake were shrouded, swallowed by the mist. The shore was now only a dim silhouette in the distance, fading into nothingness as the boat drifted further out into the thick, suffocating blanket of fog. I tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread that settled over me, focusing instead on the task ahead. The air was damp, cold against my skin, but it wasn't the chill that made my heart race. It was the feeling of isolation, the complete, disorienting silence that hung in the air, broken only by the faint murmur of the motor and the slow, rhythmic lapping of water against the boat. There was no sound of birds, no rustle of leaves, just this strange and unnatural quiet that settled over the entire lake, as though it too were bracing for what was about to come. I couldn't see anything. Not the water, not the shore, not even the boat's wake, which normally left a trail behind me. The fog had become so thick that the world had shrunk to a narrow, murky cylinder, just me, the boat, and the dark water that seemed to stretch on forever. My breath felt shallow, each exhale caught in my chest, my eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the haze around me. And then, as though the fog itself were waiting for me to make my move, it parted, just a little. It was subtle at first, a thin crack in the mist, a gap that revealed only dark water. But through that sliver of visibility, I saw something else. The ripples. They were faint at first, just small disruptions on the surface, as though something beneath was stirring. I strained my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a passing wave. The ripples spread outward in perfect, deliberate circles, emanating from something deep below. The silence felt more oppressive now, and a cold sweat gathered on my forehead. I swallowed hard, knowing what was coming. The lake had never been this quiet before. There was no escaping it this time. The creature was here. I clenched the harpoon in my hands, gripping it like a lifeline. My other hand rested on the wheel, my knuckles white from the tension, but my mind felt clouded, unsure of what to do next. The fog closed in again, thickening around me, but this time I felt its presence more, like something was moving through it, something far larger than me. The shadows beneath the water began to stir, dark shapes moving in the depths, their massive forms distorting the water's surface in strange, undulating patterns. It wasn't just the typical fish or debris. These were deliberate, slow movements. The creature was circling, waiting, almost as if it were savoring the moment before it struck. And then, without warning, it surged forward. A powerful force from beneath the boat, a swell of water that pushed the boat off balance. I barely had time to react as the boat rocked violently, threatening to capsize. I gripped the edge, fighting to steady myself, to keep my footing. The ripples grew more intense, turning into waves that slapped against the sides of the boat, each one stronger than the last. The creature was coming, and it was coming fast. I could see its shape now, just below the surface, a massive, serpentine form, darker than the depths of the lake itself, its scales glimmering like shadows in the murky water. But the most terrifying thing wasn't its size. It was its eyes. Those same glowing eyes, now visible through the water, unblinking, locked onto me with an intensity that paralyzed me where I stood. It was watching, studying, calculating. The boat lurched again, this time with such force that I almost lost my grip on the harpoon. I could feel the pull of the water, something massive beneath me, dragging at the hull, trying to tip the boat over. My heart was racing now, my thoughts scrambling. It wasn't a fish, it wasn't a mistake. This was the creature. The thing that had been stalking me since the moment I first stepped onto the water. I had no choice now but to face it. The fog swirled around me, thick and impenetrable, but I could feel the creature closing in, moving beneath the surface like a predator preparing to strike. I knew I couldn't run, not anymore. The lake, the creature, had already claimed me. It was time to confront what I had come here to face. The harpoon felt heavy in my hands, but I gripped it tighter, taking a deep breath as I prepared for the inevitable. I wasn't sure if I would survive this, but I knew one thing for certain: the encounter had begun, and there would be no turning back. The boat cut through the water with a dull hum, the only sound that seemed to exist in this vast, empty expanse. The fog, still heavy and relentless, clung to the surface of Lake Erie, thick as smoke. I couldn't see beyond a few feet in any direction, and yet I felt the creature's presence, lurking just beneath the surface. It was as if the very air around me had become saturated with its weight, and every ripple in the water seemed to reverberate with its unseen form. The center of the lake. That was where I was heading now. The place where I had first sensed the enormity of what I was dealing with, and where I knew the creature made its home. Somewhere deep beneath, it waited, watching me, following me. I could feel the pull of it, a dark gravity drawing me closer to its lair. I'd come for one reason: to end it. To face it. To find out once and for all if this ancient terror was real, and if it could be stopped. Or if I, too, was destined to disappear beneath the waves, swallowed by the very thing that had haunted these waters for centuries. The boat rocked gently as I brought it to a stop in the middle of the lake. For a moment, everything was silent. The fog hung heavy around me, like a veil over the world, and the water, unnaturally still, mirrored the sky above. There was no wind, no ripples, nothing. The lake was holding its breath. I had prepared for this moment. I had armed myself with everything I thought might help me survive: a harpoon, a knife, flares, anything that could give me a chance if things went wrong. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew there was no true preparation for what was to come. No amount of gear, no amount of courage could truly prepare me for the thing that lived beneath this water. I gripped the harpoon tighter, my hands slick with sweat despite the cold. My eyes scanned the water, searching for any movement, but it was so eerily calm. The shadows beneath the surface were impossible to make out, as if the creature was hiding itself just below the line of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. A soft sound broke the stillness. A slight disturbance in the water, barely noticeable at first, but growing slowly closer. It was a ripple, just one at first, small and almost insignificant. But then there were more. A series of them, spreading out from the center of the lake like ripples from a stone dropped into a pond. The water, once perfectly still, began to shift as though something massive was stirring beneath. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as the first signs of the creature's presence made themselves known. It was no longer subtle. It wasn't hiding. The lake was waking up, and with it, the beast. I felt the boat lurch, just a little, a small shift in balance. And then, the water around me began to churn. Slowly at first, then building in speed and intensity, as though the creature was testing the waters, circling me, preparing for the final strike. I could feel the force beneath the surface, its movement pushing the water into waves that now slapped against the sides of the boat. It wasn't just a ripple anymore. It was a surge, a primal force, like a storm that had been brewing deep below. And then, through the fog, it appeared. A shadow, dark and massive, loomed beneath the water. It was impossible to make out its full shape, but I could see enough. The shape of it, twisting and undulating, stretching for what felt like miles. The creature was enormous, far larger than anything I had ever imagined. Its form was serpentine, its movements slow but deliberate, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. And those eyes. The same glowing, monstrous eyes. They pierced through the fog and the water, locking onto me with an intensity that froze me in place. It was like the world had stopped, and for a moment, I could only see those eyes, glowing with a malevolent intelligence. It was as if the creature could feel my fear, feeding on it, enjoying the terror that flooded my veins. I tightened my grip on the harpoon. The creature was circling, its form a dark, twisting mass beneath the surface. It was coming for me. I could feel the water moving, the boat rocking violently, as though the lake itself was trying to throw me off. The ripples had turned into waves, crashing against the sides of the boat with increasing force. My heart pounded in my ears, my breath shallow as I prepared for the final confrontation. The water surged upward, and the creature's massive head broke the surface. It was a grotesque, horrifying sight. Its face was like nothing I had ever seen, dark, ancient, with scales that shimmered in the dim light of the fog. Its eyes were as large as dinner plates, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. It was a predator, and I was its prey. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth, each one longer than my arm. It let out a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the water, vibrating the boat beneath me. I could feel the pressure building, the creature's breath stirring the water around me as it prepared to strike. I had no choice. I raised the harpoon, aiming for the massive form just beneath the surface. My fingers were numb from fear, but I held steady, taking aim at the thing that had haunted me for so long. I could see the darkness in its eyes, darkness that promised destruction. With a deep breath, I threw the harpoon. It cut through the fog and the water, flying toward the creature with everything I had. But before I could even see if it would hit, the lake exploded. The creature lunged, its massive body surging out of the water, and the boat was thrown into chaos. I was thrown backward, the harpoon useless now as the boat rocked and splintered beneath the sheer force of the creature's attack. In those last moments, I realized the terrifying truth: there was no defeating it, no escaping it. The creature had claimed the lake, and I had been foolish enough to think I could challenge it. The water closed over me. The last thing I saw was the creature's glowing eyes, locked onto mine, before everything went black. The water around the boat began to tremble with an unnerving, rhythmic vibration, like a distant earthquake rumbling from deep beneath the surface. My heart pounded, and every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. The silence of the lake had transformed into a heavy, oppressive stillness, thick with anticipation. The fog rolled in tighter, swallowing the boat in a suffocating embrace. For a moment, the world was reduced to nothing but the dim glow of the fog and the low, thunderous sound of water churning beneath me. And then, the surface of the water exploded. A massive, dark shape shot up from the depths, sending a spray of water high into the air. It was a blur at first, an enormous shadow emerging from the murk, but then it became clear, too clear. The creature rose from the depths, its body breaking through the surface like a monstrous tidal wave, pushing the water back in all directions. I could hear the wet slap of its scales as it breached, the immense power of its movement shaking the very air around me. It was far larger than I had ever imagined. The size of it was beyond anything my mind could comprehend. The serpent-like body twisted and undulated as it rose, its dark, glistening scales reflecting what little light filtered through the fog. The sheer length of it seemed impossible, like a mountain of darkness stretching out beneath the surface, its body coiling and uncoiling in a slow, deliberate motion. The boat rocked violently, nearly capsizing from the force of the water crashing against it. I grabbed the sides desperately, my knuckles turning white from the pressure. The creature's massive head emerged, followed by its long, sinuous neck. It was like looking at a nightmare made flesh, a beast so old and so powerful that it seemed to have been born from the very bones of the earth itself. Its eyes were the first thing I saw, glowing with a cold, predatory gleam. They were impossibly large, glowing like lanterns, their depth seeming to pull me in, holding me captive in their eerie stare. The eyes locked onto mine with a chilling certainty, as though it knew exactly who I was and why I was here. I was nothing more than prey to it. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth that could tear through bone like paper. A low growl rumbled from deep within its throat, a sound so guttural it vibrated through my chest, sending a wave of terror crashing over me. My breath caught in my throat. There was no denying it now, the legends were true. The beast was real. The water around me churned, waves rising in violent ripples, the boat rocking dangerously. I could hear the creak of the wood beneath me, the strain of the boat as it struggled to stay afloat in the wake of the creature's movements. My mind raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I frantically searched for some way to defend myself, but there was nothing. I was outmatched, outclassed. The beast didn't hurry. It didn't need to. Its movements were slow, deliberate, each coil of its body sending massive waves of water crashing into the boat. It was playing with me, toying with its prey before the final strike. Suddenly, the beast surged forward. Its enormous body slammed against the boat with the force of a freight train, sending me flying to the side. The boat tilted dangerously, and I barely managed to grab hold of the edge to keep from falling into the water. I looked up just in time to see the creature's massive jaws open wide. The dark, gaping maw was lined with rows of teeth that could rend flesh from bone in a single bite. I knew I was a mere moment away from being devoured. It was no longer a question of if, it was when. The creature was closing in, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. This was its domain, and I was nothing but a fleeting, insignificant meal. In the briefest flash, I thought of everything I had left behind. The world I had known, the life I had led, and how none of it had mattered in the end. I had come here to face a myth, a legend. But now, in the face of this unspeakable terror, I realized that the true horror was not in the creature itself, but in the futility of my struggle. I could hear the water rippling beneath me, feel the boat being dragged by an invisible force. The creature was coming for me. I had only one chance. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pushed myself upright, gripping the harpoon with trembling hands. The creature was so close now, its enormous eyes narrowing as it moved in for the kill. I raised the harpoon, aiming for the massive throat of the beast. It was all or nothing. With a final, desperate thrust, I hurled the harpoon toward the creature. It sliced through the fog and the water like a spear, but the moment it struck, I realized my mistake. The harpoon had no chance of penetrating the creature's thick, armored scales. It was a futile gesture, nothing more than a desperate cry for survival. The creature responded in kind. With a single, crushing motion, it lunged toward the boat, its massive body erupting from the water in a final, terrifying surge. Time slowed. I saw the gleam of its teeth, heard the thunderous roar of its attack, and then darkness. I felt the boat shudder beneath me, its frame groaning under the unimaginable weight that slammed into it. The creature's immense form collided with the boat, sending waves of force through the water, tearing at the hull. A deafening roar filled my ears as the boat tipped dangerously, and I was thrown to the side, landing hard against the wet, cold floor. My heart raced, my breath shallow and frantic. The water around me surged as if the lake itself was alive, pulling at the boat with a ferocity that felt almost deliberate. I could hear the deep, resonant growls from beneath, the dark shadows of the creature pressing closer, drawing nearer. With adrenaline surging through my veins, I scrambled to my feet. The boat was sinking, slowly, but steadily, and I could feel it. The pressure in the water was intensifying, as though something immense was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to strike. I reached for the engine, fingers trembling as I tried to restart it, praying it would roar to life. But there was no response. The creature's attack had disabled it, leaving me stranded in the heart of the lake, with no escape in sight. The boat rocked violently again, this time almost tipping completely over. My grip on the edge of the boat tightened as the water rose around me. The fog thickened, swallowing everything in its path, until I couldn't even see the shoreline anymore. There was nothing but the howling wind, the dark water, and the ever-present threat below. Then, I saw it again. A ripple broke the surface, followed by the unmistakable shadow of the creature's body, massive, undulating through the water like a leviathan, its coils twisting with terrifying speed. The creature's glowing eyes glared at me through the fog, its massive head rising toward the boat with horrifying purpose. I tried to push away, using the paddle to create some distance, but the water was too strong. It was as though the lake itself had turned against me, pulling me deeper into the abyss. My entire body was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sheer terror of knowing that there was nowhere to hide. No escape. With one last desperate cry, I grabbed the paddle again, trying to push against the current. But before I could react, the creature struck. The water around me exploded as the beast surged forward with terrifying speed. Its massive tail slammed into the side of the boat, splintering the wood and throwing me into the water. I gasped for air, struggling to stay afloat as the cold lake closed around me like a suffocating blanket. My legs kicked desperately, but the water was too strong, too unyielding. Then, the darkness beneath me stirred. I barely had time to react before the creature's jaws snapped shut around the edge of the boat, dragging it, along with me, beneath the surface. The force of the pull was immense, crushing my chest as the water rushed into my lungs. The boat was being dragged deeper and deeper, the weight of the creature too much for it to withstand. I felt the wood crack and splinter around me as the coldness of the depths surrounded me, drowning out all sound but the deafening roar of the water. I was being dragged under. The creature's massive form loomed beneath me, its teeth glinting in the murky water, and I could feel the pressure of its enormous body moving around me, tightening, squeezing. It was as if the very water itself was alive and in league with the beast, pulling me closer to the depths. I fought against it, thrashing with everything I had, trying to break free, but it was hopeless. The lake had become an endless void, and the creature, a living nightmare, was intent on pulling me down with it. A sharp pain shot through my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might drown right there in the inky blackness. But I refused to give up. With every last ounce of strength, I twisted and kicked, trying to escape its grasp. But then I saw it, its jaws, open wide, ready to close around me in a final, fatal bite. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just my body that was being hunted. It was my very soul, pulled into the darkness, to be consumed, to never be seen again. I gasped for air, struggling to stay conscious. The water was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt before, as though it was trying to freeze me from the inside out. And then, darkness. I was weightless. For a moment, everything went silent, as if the world had paused, frozen in time. The violent struggle, the crushing pressure, the screams in my mind, all of it stopped. I could feel nothing but the cold embrace of the lake's depths, holding me in its merciless grip. The water was so still now, so unnaturally still, as if the creature itself had suspended everything around me, giving me one final, fleeting moment of awareness before the end. And then, I saw it. The creature's eyes were the first thing to appear, glowing faintly in the dim light that filtered through the depths. They were enormous, impossibly large, and yet somehow filled with an intelligence that went beyond instinct. They were cold, alien, as though they had seen the world long before humanity had even begun to take shape. They weren't just eyes, they were windows into something far older, far darker. The creature itself was even more terrifying up close. Its immense body stretched out before me, a living serpent of nightmares. It was covered in dark, glistening scales, each one a perfect, seamless piece of armor that seemed to absorb the dim light, making it blend with the surrounding darkness. Its form twisted and coiled in the water with a terrifying grace, moving with the kind of power that could obliterate anything in its path. As it loomed closer, I saw the full scope of its size, and my mind recoiled. It was far more than I had ever imagined, more than I had ever feared. The beast was not just a predator. It was a force of nature, something ancient and unstoppable. The scales on its massive body shimmered, like a tidal wave of darkness moving through the water, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I had been wrong all along. This wasn't just some creature lurking in the lake. It was a living relic, a remnant of a forgotten world, one that had lived for centuries, perhaps millennia. It had seen civilizations rise and fall, witnessed the passing of time in a way no human could comprehend. It was not just a predator, hunting for food. It was an entity, born from the depths of the earth, an indomitable force that had been here long before I ever set foot on the lake. And it would remain long after I was gone. The water around me seemed to ripple, the pressure rising, and I realized that I was no longer in control of my body. I was drifting, helpless, as if the lake itself had claimed me. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't. There was no escape. The creature's mouth opened, impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the murky water. They weren't just teeth, they were instruments of destruction, designed to tear through flesh and bone, to rip apart anything that dared to enter its domain. And I was nothing but prey now. But as its massive jaws closed in on me, I saw something else. A deeper, more horrifying truth. The creature wasn't just an animal. It was a manifestation of the lake itself, a physical embodiment of its power, its ancient, unyielding presence. It was not bound by the rules of nature that governed the world above. It was something older, something far darker. I felt its presence seep into my very soul, like an inescapable darkness, a force so overwhelming that it threatened to swallow every last shred of my humanity. In that instant, I knew that it wasn't just hunting me, it was claiming me, dragging me into the depths where time and space had no meaning. It wasn't just taking my life, it was erasing me. I would cease to exist in the world above, swallowed whole by the ancient force of the lake. As the creature's jaws closed around me, my mind would blank. The cold, oppressive darkness swallowed everything, the fear, the terror, the hope for survival. There was no more struggle, no more fight. There was only the pull of the depths, the suffocating embrace of the creature, and the eerie, eternal silence that followed. I was no longer a man. I was a part of the lake, an offering to the ancient force that had ruled these waters for centuries. And in that moment, I understood. The lake had claimed me. The darkness closed in around me, thick and suffocating, as the lake swallowed me whole. The water was no longer just cold, it was icy, like the very heart of the earth had frozen over, and I could feel it creeping into my bones, numbing my flesh, stealing away the last remnants of warmth. My body was heavy, a weight pulling me deeper into the abyss, and I couldn't fight it anymore. There was no escape. The beast's enormous jaws gripped me with terrifying precision, its teeth sinking through flesh and muscle, tearing me apart. My mind screamed, but there was no sound, only the gurgling of water rushing into my lungs, the suffocating pressure of the depths closing in. I could feel my chest tightening, my breath slowing, and the edges of my vision starting to blur. I was drowning, sinking deeper into the inky blackness. As I descended, I felt an odd detachment from my own body. The cold water numbed the pain, leaving only the dreadful awareness of my fate. The terror I had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by a strange calmness, like I was drifting through some other world, one where time didn't matter. But then, as my thoughts slowed, I felt the unmistakable presence of the creature wrapping itself around me. Its immense body, slick with cold water, coiled around me like an ancient, unfeeling force. It wasn't just devouring me, it was consuming everything that made me who I was. My memories, my thoughts, my very essence, they were slipping away, sucked into the void, absorbed by the creature's insatiable hunger. This is it, I thought, the final truth dawning on me as I sank deeper into the crushing darkness. There would be no rescue. No one would ever know what had truly happened to me. The creature had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others before me. And in my final moments, a single thought pierced through the haze of fear and despair. I am no longer part of the world above. I am part of the lake now. Part of the thing that rules its depths. And I will never be seen again. The pressure around me tightened, and I could feel the creature's monstrous form shift as it prepared to finish its work. The last breath I took was swallowed by the water, filling my lungs with the freezing cold of the depths. And then, nothing. Just darkness. The lake had taken me. The creature had consumed me, body and soul. And as my body sank into the endless depths, I became one with the ancient force that had ruled Lake Erie for centuries, lost to the world forever. Lead you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.